Welcome to Ranger Screams. If you're looking for something to listen to while you sleep, or simply want to relax and enjoy some scary stories, we're truly happy to have you here. Before we begin, if you're enjoying the content, we'd really appreciate your help in reaching 1,000 likes and 1,000 comments. Thank you from the bottom of our hearts for being here and supporting the channel. Now get comfortable, and let's begin. The village of Anvilak sits on the north bank of the Ninamuc River, 55 river miles above the point where the Ninamuc lets go of itself into Norton Sound. I want to describe the place accurately before I describe anything else, because people who have never been to Western Alaska hear the word remote and picture a cabin in a snowfield with a wolf outside the door, and that picture will lead you wrong about everything that follows. Anvilak has a post office. It has a fuel depot with 3 tanks and a hand-lettered sign about no smoking within 50 feet. It has a school with 2 teachers and a satellite uplink, a washateria with 4 machines and a shower room, a store that sells shotgun shells and frozen pizza and disposable diapers at prices that would make a person from Ohio sit down on the floor. It has a clinic staffed by a community health aide named Priscilla Uyak, who has forgotten more emergency medicine than most urgent care physicians will ever learn. And it has a doctor by telephone whenever Priscilla wants one. It has a gravel strip long enough for a caravan, and in good weather 2 flights a day from Unalakleet. It has a VHF repeater on the hill behind the church, and a tribal council, and a basketball court that is the true center of the community from October to April. 372 people lived in Anvilak the year I arrived. Inupiat families mostly, with a few Yupik in-laws from downriver, and a handful of white residents who had come in for a season 30 years ago and simply never generated the momentum to leave. There were 2 teachers, a village public safety officer, an itinerant Alaska State Trooper who came through when a trooper was needed, and me. The point I'm making is that Anvilak is not the wilderness. Anvilak is a town. It has electricity and running water and people arguing about the school board. The wilderness begins about 2 miles east of the last house, where the dwarf birch gives out and the country opens into rolling tundra that climbs, over the course of 30 miles, into the Talayan Hills. That distinction matters more than anything else I am going to tell you. There were people, there were witnesses. There were 400 human beings living within 1.5 miles of the tree line, and every one of them knew something I did not. I arrived on September 9th, 2012, on a Tuesday afternoon caravan out of Unalakleet, with 11 totes of gear and a dog crate containing a 9-year-old Chesapeake Bay Retriever named Ruby. I was 41 years old. I had been with the National Park Service for 16 years, the last 9 of them in Alaska. My posting was a 12-month assignment as resident ranger for the eastern unit of Tulan National Preserve, about 1,900 square miles of tundra, river drainage, and low mountain terrain, running from Anvilak east to the Tulan Crest and north to the Kigalik Divide. My duties were unremarkable for a 1-ranger station: backcountry patrol, subsistence use monitoring and reporting, cabin and shelter maintenance, wildlife observation surveys under a cooperative agreement with Fish and Game, coordination with the VPSO on search and rescue, and the thing that is never in the job description but is actually the job, being a federal face that people can put a name to, so that when the agency does something the village hates, there is at least a person to be angry at instead of an acronym. The posting had been vacant for 19 months when I took it. That fact was in the file. Nobody discussed it. My regional chief, a man named Doug Farrar, who ran the interior units out of Fairbanks, and who I had known and liked for 6 years, mentioned the vacancy only in terms of logistics. The station generator hadn't been serviced. The snow machine had sat 2 winters and would need a carburetor. The propane inventory was probably a fiction. Somebody should walk the eastern cabins before freeze-up, because the Kigalik shelter had a roof problem in the last inspection, and the last inspection was from 2010. He did not tell me why the previous ranger had left. When I asked, and I asked casually, the way you ask about a house's previous owner, Doug said the man had requested a hardship transfer and gotten it. The name in the file was Gerald Pike. I had never met him. I knew people who had. 14 years in the Park Service, 8 of them in Alaska units. A competent and profoundly unexciting man of the type the agency runs on. Not somebody who breaks a 12-month assignment at the 7-month mark. I asked Doug if I could talk to Pike before I flew in. Doug said Pike had retired. I asked when. Doug looked at his coffee and said, "About 4 months after he came out." I want to be precise about my mental state on arrival, because it becomes evidence later and I would rather introduce it myself than have someone else introduce it for me. I was not frightened. I was not lonely. I was not fragile. I had wintered alone before, twice. A season at a patrol cabin on the Kobuk, and a season on the Seward Peninsula out of Shishmaref. Both of them full, dark, and cold. Both of them fine. I understood the arithmetic of a northern winter. The light budget, the fuel budget, the sleep budget, the way December takes things away from you slowly enough that you don't notice the theft until February presents the bill. I had a divorce 9 years behind me, no children, no debt, no history of depression or anxiety or any psychiatric condition of any kind, and a physical that year that my doctor described as annoying. I say all this because when people hear what happened at Anvilak, the first explanation they reach for is that I was the kind of woman who goes north to get away from something and finds it waiting for her. I wasn't. I was, by every measure the agency uses, one of the most stable field employees in the region. That is precisely why they gave me the station. The ranger station sat at the northeast edge of the village, about 200 yards past the last occupied house, on a low rise above the slough. It was a government structure of the standard 1980s design, brown-painted plywood over a log frame, metal roof, single story, 3 rooms and a mudroom. There was an equipment shed behind it with bays for the snow machine and the four-wheeler, a rack of survey gear, and 4 fuel drums. A 30-foot VHF mast rose from a guide pad beside the shed. The cabin had electric baseboard off a diesel generator, a backup wood stove, an oil range, water from a holding tank filled weekly by the village utility truck, and a satellite phone in a wall cradle in the kitchen. Comfortable by field standards, ordinary by Anvilak standards. There were 3 houses in the village with better heat than mine. I spent the first 3 weeks doing what you do. I introduced myself to the VPSO, a broad, unhurried man in his 50s named Toby Anagik, who had held the position 11 years, and who greeted me by asking whether the dog was any good or just decorative. I sat with the tribal council for 40 minutes and answered questions about the preserve's subsistence rules, most of which I answered with, "I'll find out and tell you honestly," which is the only answer that ever builds anything. I walked the school and let 60 children pull Ruby's ears. I rebuilt the snow machine carburetor. I filed my initial station report. I made myself visible, which is the single most important thing a lone federal officer can do in a small community, because visibility becomes familiarity, and familiarity is the only authority that actually functions when you are the only federal employee within 90 miles. Toby Anagik was helpful in the specific, generous, information-dense way of a man who has decided you are going to be his problem for a year and would rather you be a competent problem. He walked me through the seasonal calendar. When the caribou of the Tulan herd came through and by which drainages, which families ran which trap lines, and where the unmarked lines were that I would be an idiot to interfere with, where the river ice went bad in November and stayed bad, which stretch of the winter trail toward Kigallik drifted so hard that you should just plan on staying home. He was thorough. He was funny in a dry, sidelong way. He was, I thought, entirely without mystery. There was one conversation in those first weeks that I did not understand and did not think much about, and that I have gone back over perhaps 1,000 times since. We were standing outside the Washiteria on a bright afternoon at the end of September. The tundra east of town had turned, that hard, saturated, unbelievable red and orange that low bush country does for about 10 days each fall, before the color drains out of the world for 8 months. The Tulan Hills were sharp on the horizon, already white on the tops. I was talking about patrol routes. I said I planned to run the eastern drainages hard through October while the ground was frozen and bare, get my survey transects done before the snow, and then set up a winter rotation that would let me get to the Kigallik shelter and back on a 3-day loop. Toby listened. Then he said, "How far east are you going?" I said, as far as the unit boundary, 30-some miles. He nodded and looked at the hills for a while. Then he said, "There's a line of stakes out there. Old survey stakes, orange tops, maybe 11 miles out. You'll see them on the ridge above the second creek." I said I'd noted them on the plat. "In summer, go past them all you want," Toby said. "In winter, people from here don't." I asked why not. He thought about how to answer. I remember that clearly. The pause was not evasive, it was editorial. He was choosing among several true things. "Bad country in winter," he said. "Goes soft." I said I didn't follow. Tundra doesn't go soft in winter. Winter is the only time tundra is reliable. "That's right," Toby said. "That's the thing about it." And then he asked me whether I wanted to buy a raffle ticket for the Search and Rescue Snow Machine Fund, and I bought 4, and the conversation was over. I want to be fair to him, because a lot of what happened after is a consequence of things Toby Anagik did not say to me, and I have had years to decide whether I hold that against him. I don't. He told me exactly as much as a person can tell an outsider who has arrived with a badge and a federal vehicle and a 12-month contract. He told me the rule. He did not tell me the reason for the rule, because the reason is not the sort of thing you hand to a stranger, and because, I understand this now, he did not believe I would go past the stakes in winter anyway. Nobody had in his experience except the Rangers, and the Rangers only ever did it once each. October in that country is the last honest month. The days shorten fast. You lose 7 minutes a day at that latitude, which is a rate you can feel. But the ground freezes hard and dry before the snow comes. And for 4 or 5 weeks, the tundra is the best travel surface on Earth. Frozen tussocks, no overflow, no drifts. You can run a machine at 30 miles an hour across ground that in July would take you 9 hours to walk a mile of. I ran my first solo patrol on October 4th. 14 miles east on the snow machine over bare frozen ground, following the second creek drainage, glassing for caribou. I carried binoculars, a GPS, a camera, a survival kit, a rifle in a scabbard, and a sidearm on my hip, and 2 thermoses because I have never once regretted a second thermos. I was out 9 hours. I logged 41 caribou in 3 groups, all cows and calves, moving south and west. I logged ptarmigan, a crossfox, ravens, and old wolfkill scattered over 100 yards of frost-heaved ground. I photographed a collapsed trapper's cache that wasn't on any of my maps and recorded the coordinates for the cultural resources people who would never come look at it. Normal October, good October. I ran 6 more patrols over the next 3 weeks, varying the route each time, working my survey transects, learning the country the way you have to learn a place you intend to travel in the dark, by shape rather than by landmark, by the way the drainages relate to each other rather than by any single feature. The country east of Anvilak is enormous and open, low tundra rising in long swells toward the Tulan foothills, cut by shallow creeks, broken here and there by stands of willow along the water and by frost-shattered rock on the higher ground. Visibility runs for miles. You can watch weather arrive from an hour away. It is not a landscape that hides things. I believed that for about 6 weeks. On October 26th, on my 7th patrol, I found the bull. I was 11.5 miles out, just past the stake line on the long ridge above the second creek. The stakes were where Toby had said, a row of weathered lath with faded orange tops, set at 100-meter intervals by some survey crew in the 70s, marching north-northeast across the ridge and out of sight in both directions. I noted them and went by them without thinking about it, because it was October, and the rule Toby had given me was about winter, and I am a literal-minded person. There had been a skiff of snow 2 nights before, an inch, not enough to travel on but enough to hold sign. Perfect tracking snow. I was moving slowly along the ridge with the machine, stopping every quarter mile to glass, when I saw an animal standing about 300 yards off the ridge on the north side, down in the shallow bowl where the ground drops toward the creek, a bull caribou. A big one, heavy-bodied, dark, with a rack I estimated at 40 inches, still carrying velvet remnants in strips. He was standing broadside to me, facing east. I glassed him for a while because a big bull alone in late October is worth noting, and because he was in beautiful light. Then I put the binoculars down and drove 100 yards closer and glassed him again. He had not moved. That is not, in itself, unusual. Caribou stand. They stand for long periods, particularly bulls in the rut aftermath, particularly in cold. But there is a thing that a standing animal does. A constant, low-level, unconscious activity. Ears rotate. The head shifts a degree or two. Weight moves from one hind leg to another. Breath fogs and thins in a rhythm. A caribou at rest at -5 is a machine idling. This animal was not idling. I watched him through the glass for a full 4 minutes by my watch. In 4 minutes, he did not move his head, his ears, his tail, or his weight. There was no vapor at his nose. My first assumption was the obvious one. He was dead and had frozen standing, which is uncommon, but not unheard of. Animals die on their feet and lock up in a hard freeze before they fall, especially if the legs are braced and the ground is uneven. I have seen it twice before, both times with moose in the interior. So I got off the machine and walked down to him. I want to describe this carefully. The ground in the bowl was frozen hard, dusted with the 2-day-old snow, and the snow was undisturbed except for the bull's own tracks coming in from the east. His tracks came in a straight line from the eastern lip of the bowl, about 200 yards, and they ended where he stood. There were no other tracks. No wolf sign, no bear sign, no human sign. I stopped 20 feet from him and looked at him for a long time. He was in excellent condition. Fat over the ribs and rump, coat thick and unbroken, no injury, no visible wound, no discharge at the nose or eyes, no scavenger damage of any kind. And that last one is the detail that I could not put down. He had been standing there long enough for 2 days of snow to settle undisturbed on his back, and not one raven had touched him. There were ravens in that country everywhere. There had been 11 of them on the wolf kill I photographed the week before, and that kill was a year old and a scatter of bone. His eyes were open. They were clear. Not clouded, not sunken, not frosted at the lashes the way a dead animal's eyes frost. I took my glove off and touched his shoulder. He was warm, not warm like an animal, warm like a stone in the sun, which is an absurd comparison to make about an object standing in 17-degree air at 4 in the afternoon in October under a gray sky. Warm underneath the hair, a deep, even, unhurried warmth that had no business existing. I stepped back. Then I put my hand flat on his chest behind the elbow, in the place where you feel for a heartbeat on a downed animal. There was one. It was very slow. I counted it against my watch for 90 seconds and got 7 beats. A resting caribou runs somewhere around 40. 7 beats per minute is not a caribou heart rate. 7 beats per minute is not a mammal heart rate outside of a hibernating ground squirrel with its body temperature near freezing, and caribou do not hibernate, and this animal was warmer than I was. I stood in that bowl with my hand on the ribcage of a living animal that was doing nothing, and for the first time in 9 years in Alaska, I had the specific sensation of standing next to something I could not name. I did what I am trained to do. I documented. I photographed the bull from 8 angles and from 6 feet and from 30 yards. I photographed the track line coming in from the east and the undisturbed snow around him. I photographed my own boot beside his hoof for scale. I recorded a 2-minute video, holding as steady as I could, so the absolute stillness would be on record in a way a still image can't show. I logged coordinates, time, ambient temperature, 17 degrees Fahrenheit, wind, cloud cover. I made a written note of the heart rate and the surface temperature, and the fact that there was no scavenging. Then, because I could not think of anything else to do that was within the scope of my authority, I left him there and drove back to Anvilak in the last of the light. I want to be honest about what I felt on that ride, because it is the last time in this account that I felt something simple. I felt excited. I thought I had found a disease. I want to lay out the reporting chain, because the failure of that chain is not incidental to this story. It is most of the story. That night I wrote up the observation as a wildlife incident and sent it to Doug Farrar and, per the cooperative agreement, to the Fish and Game Area biologist in Nome, a woman named Karen Ostrand whom I had met twice and found sharp. I attached 6 photographs in the video. I described the animal's condition, the heart rate, the surface warmth, the absence of scavenging, and the undisturbed snow. I used careful, unexcited language. I did not editorialize. I flagged it as a possible novel disease presentation and recommended sampling. Karen wrote back at 10 the next morning, which for a state biologist in October is the equivalent of sprinting. She said the heart rate was almost certainly a measurement error, that palpating a bradycardic pulse through a winter coat with a gloved hand and a wristwatch is not a method, and she was right about that, and I had said as much myself. She said the warmth was probably a misperception caused by my hand being cold, which is a real phenomenon, and also right. She said the standing posture with hind legs braced was consistent with post-mortem freezing, but she also said the absence of scavenging was genuinely strange, and that if I could get back out there, she wanted a blood draw, a lymph node if I could manage it, and a brain sample if the animal was demonstrably dead, because there is a family of prion and encephalitic conditions that produce standing catatonia in ungulates, and every one of them is a thing the state very badly wants to know about early. She said she'd send a sampling kit on the Thursday plane. Doug wrote back 4 days later saying good documentation, keep him posted, and did I have a fuel figure for him yet? That was the system working exactly as designed. Nobody was negligent. Nobody was covering anything up. A lone ranger reported a strange dead animal, and a biologist 800 air miles away applied the correct default assumption, which is that lone rangers in the dark make measurement errors, and requested the samples that would settle it. I got the kit on Thursday, November 1st. I went back out on Friday. The bull was gone. I want to be exact. I navigated to the coordinates. I found the bowl, the ridge, the stake line, the second creek. All correct. All confirmed on GPS to within 20 feet. There had been 4 inches of new snow since October 26th, which meant his tracks were gone, and any tracks of whatever moved him were gone too. But the place where he had stood was bare. There was a patch of exposed ground roughly 9 feet across, an irregular oval, with no snow on it at all. The tundra inside it was dark and wet-looking, the lichen and moss visibly hydrated, some of it a deep green that had no business existing on the last day of October at that latitude. Around the edge of the oval, the 4 inches of snow ended in a clean melt line, slightly scalloped, the way snow ends at the edge of a heated slab. I put my bare hand on the ground inside the oval. It was warm. 45, 50 degrees, warmer than the air by 35 degrees. I took a thermometer from the sampling kit and pushed the probe 2 inches down and got 51.3 degrees Fahrenheit. I moved 15 feet outside the oval and pushed the probe into the frozen ground, and it wouldn't go in. There was no smell. There was no seep, no water flowing, no sign of a spring. Groundwater springs exist in that country, and they do keep patches open through the winter, and my first thought was, thermal spring, and the bull died on it, and that explains the warmth in the carcass, and I have made a fool of myself. Except a spring flows. A spring has a source and an outlet and a channel and mineral staining. This had none of those. It was a warm oval of ground, dry, in the middle of 1,900 square miles of permafrost. And the bull, 450 pounds of him, was gone, with no drag marks, no scavenger sign, no bone, no hair, no rumen contents. A wolf pack will scatter a bull across an acre and leave the hide and the leg bones and a smell you can find a week later. A bear will bury it. Neither of them will make 450 pounds of caribou vanish off a snowfield without leaving a mark. I stood at the edge of that oval for a while. I remember I kept looking behind me, which is not a thing I do. Then I did my job. I photographed everything. I took soil temperature at 11 points on a transect through the oval and recorded the gradient. I took 2 soil samples from inside it into the sterile containers meant for tissue, labeled them clearly as substitutions, and sealed them. I collected a plug of the green moss. I marked the perimeter with 4 flagged wands. I filed the report that night. Subject animal absent, site anomaly documented, soil samples collected, requesting guidance. Karen Ostrand called me on the sat phone the next afternoon, which she had never done. She wanted to know how confident I was in the thermometer. I said it was a factory-calibrated field probe out of a sealed kit that she had sent me herself. She asked me to say the number again. I said 51.3. She was quiet for a second and then said, "Delia, that's not a thing." I said I was aware of that. She said she'd get the soil to the lab at UAF and see if anybody there wanted it, and she asked me to keep the site flagged and check it monthly, and then she said something that I have thought about a great deal since. She said, "Don't put the word anomaly in a written report again. Put the measurements." Somebody upstairs reads anomaly and stops reading. I took the advice. It was good advice. It is also, I think, a fairly complete explanation of how a thing like this can sit in the eastern Talon for however many thousands of years, while the state of Alaska has an office in Nome with a woman in it who is nobody's fool. I mentioned the bull to Toby Anagik on November 3rd, in the Arctic entry of his house, with his boots off and mine on, and a cup of coffee I did not want in my hands. I described the animal, the location, the warmth, the stillness, the fact that nothing had touched it. I described going back and finding the ground open and warm and the bull gone. Toby listened without interrupting, which he always did, and when I finished, he asked one question. He said, "Was it standing east?" I said yes. He asked if I was sure. I said I had a photograph and a compass bearing. It was facing 094 degrees. Toby set his coffee down and did not pick it up again. He said, "That was past the stakes." I said it was, by about half a mile, and I reminded him that his rule was a winter rule, and it had been October. And Toby Anagik, who I had never once seen hurry, said, "It's winter when the ground says so, not when the calendar does." I asked him, and I was careful, because I was aware I was pushing on a door that had been politely closed. I asked him what he thought I had found. He said, "I don't think anything. I don't go out there." I asked who did. "Nobody from here," he said. "Not in memory." I asked whether that was a religious thing or a safety thing, and I regret how I asked it, because it came out sounding like a menu with 2 options on it, one of which I obviously considered more respectable. Toby heard exactly that. He didn't take offense. He was far too used to it, but something in the room adjusted. He said, "You want it to be one or the other?" I said, "Fair enough." I said, "Then tell me it however it is." Toby thought for a long moment. Then he said, "When I was a kid, there were still people who trapped east of the stakes in the fall. Not in the dark part. In the fall. My uncle did it. They'd go out 10, 12 miles, run marten, come back before the ground went. Everybody knew you came back before the ground went. Nobody explained it, you just came back. Then one fall, my uncle didn't, and they went out and found him, and he was fine." He looked at me to see whether I understood. I said I didn't. "He was fine," Toby said. "That's what I'm telling you. He was sitting on the sled out past the second creek with his hands in his lap, and he was warm, and he was breathing, and he was fine, and he'd been out there 11 days, and there was no food gone from his pack. And they brought him home, and he lived 30 more years, and he never once said what happened to him, and he never went east again, and every year until he died he got up in the fall and told the young men, 'Come back before the ground goes.' Nobody said anything for a while. The furnace kicked on. I asked whether his uncle had been all right afterward. Mentally, I meant. And I said it as gently as I could. Toby said, 'He was better than all right. That's the part people don't like. He was the calmest man I ever knew.' I asked what it was called. Whatever it was. I asked if there was a name. And Toby Anagik said, 'Yeah.' And then he said, 'I'm not going to give it to you.' He wasn't being hostile. He said it the way a man declines to lend you a tool he knows you'll break. I have never forgotten the exact quality of that refusal, because it was the first moment in Anvilak when I understood that I was not dealing with a folk belief that a rational person tolerates politely. I was dealing with a body of knowledge that had been curated, tested, and enforced across generations by people whose survival depended on getting it right, and that had a rule structure, come back before the ground goes, and a name, and an access policy. And I was outside the access policy. The snow came properly in the second week of November, 11 inches in 3 days out of the southwest, and then it got cold. And then it stayed cold. By the 20th, we were running -15 in the daytime and -30 at night, which is normal, and we had lost the sun down to about 5.5 hours, which is also normal, and the trail east was suddenly a real trail, rather than a line on a map. That was when I started noticing the sound. I need to be careful here, because this is the part where I lose people. It was not a sound in the sense of something you hear. If I had heard it, I would have gone looking for the generator or the mast or the loose panel that was making it, and that would have been the end of it. It was at first a quality of the silence. On the still nights, and there were maybe 8 or 9 genuinely still nights that November, nights when the wind died completely and the smoke from the village stovepipes went straight up. The silence out toward the east had a texture to it, a pressure, a sense of the air being slightly loaded, the way a room feels when a large machine in the basement is running below the threshold of hearing. The first time I noticed it, I was outside at about 11 at night filling the wood box. I stopped with an armload of spruce and stood there with my head cocked like a dog for probably 90 seconds trying to identify what I was listening to, and I could not, because I was not listening to anything. There was nothing to listen to. There was just the sense that the eastern half of the world was doing something. I want to give the mundane explanations their due because I chased all of them. I shut down the generator and stood in the dark, and it was still there. I climbed the mast in the daylight and checked the guy wires for aeolian resonance, and they were fine. And anyway, there was no wind on the nights I noticed it. I checked the fuel oil line for a harmonic. I asked the school if their boiler ran overnight. I considered tinnitus and then dismissed it, because tinnitus is in your head and travels with you, and this had a direction. It was in the east. If I walked around to the west side of the station where the building was between me and the tundra, it lessened. If I walked 200 yards up the rise, it strengthened. I mentioned it once in a way I engineered to sound casual to Priscilla Uyak at the clinic when I went in for a tetanus booster. I said something like, "Does anybody here ever complain about a hum in the winter?" Priscilla was writing on a form. She didn't look up. She said, "You sleeping?" I said, "Not great." She said, "Try leaving your radio on low." And she wrote something on the form, and I asked what she was writing, and she said, "Nothing," and it was in fact nothing. I saw the form later for an unrelated reason, and there was nothing in the notes. She just did not want to look at me for a second, and she had needed something to do with her hands. The dogs told me more than the people did. There were still 4 or 5 working teams in Anvilak, and a great many loose village dogs, and the loose dogs went everywhere. They went out on the river ice. They followed snow machines for miles. They trailed hunting parties. They harassed foxes across open tundra half a day from town. They did not go east, past the last houses after freeze-up. I noticed it first with Ruby. She was a dog who had spent 9 years in Alaska and would follow me into anything. In September and early October, she rode the sled deck or ran behind the machine on every patrol, including past the stake line, and thought it was the best thing that had ever happened to her. The first patrol I ran after the snow came on November 14th, she got about 4 miles out, and then she quit. She didn't bolt. She didn't cower. She stopped following, sat down in the trail facing back toward town, and when I came back for her, she stood up and walked to me and leaned on my leg, which is a thing she did when she was worried about me. Then she went back and sat down again in the same spot, facing west, and waited. I loaded her onto the deck. She did not resist. She rode about a mile with her body rigid, her weight leaning back against me, panting at -20, which dogs do not do. Then she began to shake so hard, I could feel it through the seat. I turned around and took her home. I tried once more, 4 days later, and got the same result at almost the same spot. a little before the second creek, 3/4 of a mile short of the stake line. After that, I stopped bringing her, and after that, she stopped wanting to come, and after that, she stopped watching the door when I geared up. She would look at me while I put on my parka and then turn her face to the wall. I have owned dogs my whole life. I have never seen an animal grieve a decision I made before I made it. The last thing that November brought was the tracks. November 27th, 7 miles out on a routine run, in flat afternoon light with maybe 40 minutes of usable day left. I was following the winter trail east, and I crossed a line of snowshoe hare tracks running perpendicular, north to south, across a low open flat. Hare tracks are the most ordinary thing in that country. There is no reason on earth to stop for them, and I don't know why I did. I think it was the spacing. A hare's track pattern is a language you learn without meaning to. The tight bunches when it's browsing. The long splayed leaps when it's moving with purpose. The messy churn where it's turned. This line was neither. The bounds were absolutely even, the same length, the same alignment, for as far as I could see it running north, which was several hundred yards. Straight, perfectly straight, over ground that was not flat, through a shallow swale and up the other side, without the slightest deviation. I followed it south on the machine for about a 1/4 mile. Then the tracks ended, not petered out, not blown over. There was no wind, and the surrounding snow was pristine and holding a 2-day-old ski trail from my own previous patrol 40 yards away, so I know exactly what the drift conditions were. The tracks simply stopped. A final set of 4 prints, the 2 long hind feet, the 2 forefeet, pressed clean, and then nothing. Unbroken snow ahead for 200 yards to the willow line. No raptor strike. A hawk or an owl taking a hare leaves an unmistakable signature. Wing prints in the snow like a pressed flower. Drag marks, sometimes blood. There was nothing. The snow around that final print was as smooth as poured cement. I photographed it. I put my boot down beside the last print for scale, and while I was crouched there taking the picture, I felt the sound. Not heard it. Felt it. In the sinuses and along the jaw, the way a subwoofer 2 rooms away feels. A slow pulse, maybe one every 2 seconds, with a rhythm to it that was not the rhythm of a machine. It came up through the snow. I know that because when I stood up, it faded, and when I put my hand back down on the ground, it was there again. And when I lay flat with my ear against the snow, which I did, which I have not told anyone until now, it was so distinct that I could count it. 3 pulses. A pause. 2 pulses. A longer pause. Then 5. I got up and rode back to town at a speed that was not safe. Dr. June Alvarado came in on the December 6th plane with 4 totes, a Pelican case, a snow machine helmet, and a tripod, and she was standing on the strip in a borrowed parka, arguing with the pilot about the totes before the prop had stopped turning. She was 53, short, gray at the temples, from Las Cruces originally, 22 years at the University of Alaska Fairbanks. Her field was permafrost soil biogeochemistry, specifically the microbial ecology of thaw, which is the study of what wakes up when frozen ground stops being frozen. She had spent 2 decades measuring how much carbon comes out of thawing permafrost and in what form, and driven by which organisms, which is not a field with a lot of glamour attached to it and is arguably the most consequential field of science currently being practiced on this planet. She was in Anvilak because of my soil samples, and because of a satellite. June brought the imagery with her, printed on 11 by 17, and laid it on my kitchen table that first night with the flat of her hand. "Look at this and tell me what I'm looking at," she said, "because I've asked 6 people and I've got 6 answers I don't like." They were winter thermal composites of about 400 square miles of the eastern unit, 1 per year, going back to 1988. In the early frames, the country was uniform, the featureless cold gray you'd expect from tundra at -30, with the drainages showing very slightly warmer and the ridges very slightly colder. By 1998, there was a mark on it, a faint, irregular blotch about a mile long, oriented northeast-southwest, sitting in a shallow valley between 2 ridges roughly 14 miles east of Anvilak and 3 miles past the stake line. In the 1998 frame, it was so faint you had to be told where to look. In the 2004 frame, it was obvious. In the 2012 frame, taken 11 days before she flew in, it was a bright, coherent, sharply bounded thermal signature, covering somewhere between 300 and 400 acres, running at a mean surface temperature of 41 degrees Fahrenheit, while the ground around it was at -26, and it had a shape. It was not a blob. Along its northern edge, it extended in 3 long, narrow, roughly parallel projections, each maybe 200 meters long and 40 meters wide, running up the drainage to the northeast. "Those aren't springs," June said. "Springs don't have fingers." I asked her what she thought it was. She said, "Officially, a previously undocumented geothermal system with a shallow expression." I asked her what she thought unofficially. She said, "Unofficially, geothermal systems don't grow at 9% a year for 14 years, and they don't move uphill, and I've got a soil sample from your bare patch that has a live microbial community in it, at a density I would expect from an Iowa cornfield in June, and a fungal biomass fraction that isn't in the literature. So unofficially I have no idea, and I flew 400 miles in December to find out, which should tell you how much I don't have an idea." I liked her enormously, immediately, and I have never revised that. We spent 2 days on logistics, which is what any real field work in December is. 2 days of logistics for every hour of science. Her permits were in order. She had a research authorization for the preserve, which meant technically she needed a ranger escort for backcountry travel in winter, which meant I was not merely allowed to go with her, but obligated. I want that on the record too, because later there were people who suggested I had gone chasing this. I hadn't. It was in my job description. I told her what I had. All of it. In order. The bull. The warmth. The vanishing. The open ground. The dogs. The hair tracks. The pulse I counted with my ear against the snow. I gave her the photographs and the video and my logs. She did not laugh at any of it. She asked good questions. When I got to the counted pulses, 3, pause, 2, pause, 5, she stopped writing and asked me to say it again. And then she asked whether I had counted more than once, and I said no, and she said, "That's a shame," in a tone of real disappointment, as though I had failed to collect a data point, rather than described a thing that had frightened me badly enough that I had ridden home in the dark at 40 miles an hour. That was, I came to learn, simply how she worked. June Alvarado's response to fear was to convert it into a measurement. It is the most useful trait a person can have in the field, and it is also, I think now, the thing that undid her. The one part she pushed back on was the village. I told her about Toby, about the stakes, about the uncle who was found sitting on his sled after 11 days, warm and fine and silent for the rest of his life. June said, "I'd like to talk to him." I said I didn't think that would go well. She said, "Delia, I've worked in 11 villages. I know how to talk to people." She did know how. She was better at it than I was, in fact. She'd been doing community-based monitoring for 15 years and had none of the reflexive federal condescension that I had to actively suppress in myself. She went to Toby's, and she went to the tribal council, and she was courteous and clear, and she offered, genuinely offered, with money attached, to hire local observers and to share every scrap of data she generated with the council before she published anything. The council listened. They thanked her. They approved her access, because it was not theirs to deny on preserved land, and because they are pragmatic people who would rather be inside the process than outside it. And then Toby Anagik walked her back to the station in the dark and said one thing to her, which she reported to me that night, verbatim, because she wrote it down. He said, "You can go. She has to take you. But don't lie down." June asked what he meant. He said, "Whatever happens out there, don't lie down and don't let her lie down. Stay on your feet and come home." She wrote it in her field notebook under the heading Local Guidance and put a question mark after it. We left at 9 in the morning on December 11th with about 4 hours of workable light and a plan that assumed we would use all of it and be home in the dark, which was the plan every day out there. 2 machines. Mine towing a Siglin sled with the survival gear, the tent, the stove, 4 days of food, and a spare. We spent the next 2 hours doing science, which is the least dramatic and most reassuring activity available to a frightened person. Air temperature on the ridge, -21. Air temperature at the valley floor, 4 feet above the ground, 34. Surface temperature of the bare ground, 40 to 46 depending where we put the probe, with a fairly sharp gradient toward the center of the largest mat. Soil temperature at 10 centimeters, in a place we chose at random, 52. Relative humidity in the valley was 91%. There was a haze in the air down there, and when it settled on my parka, it was liquid water. It was raining, very slightly, from nothing, in the interior of Alaska, in December. June did a transect with a handheld gas analyzer and got carbon dioxide concentrations near the ground of about 900 parts per million against an ambient 400, and methane readings she read 3 times and then stopped reading aloud. She dug. That was the moment I saw what she actually was. A 53-year-old woman on her knees with a hand trowel in a valley that was doing something impossible, entirely absorbed, humming. Below about 2 inches of dark, wet, structureless organic soil, the profile changed. It became a mat. The best comparison I can give you is the interior of a dried mushroom, if a dried mushroom were the size of a football field and 4 inches thick and wet. It was white and cream and in places a very faint gold. It was composed of filaments. Hyphae, June said, and then corrected herself and said something like hyphae, running in every direction but not randomly. Where she cut a clean face into it with the trowel, you could see structure. Strands aggregated into cords the thickness of a pencil lead, and the cords ran in bundles, and the bundles ran parallel to each other for as far as the exposed face went, all oriented northeast. It was warm to the touch. It was hot to the touch in places. She measured 71 degrees Fahrenheit inside a cord bundle at 15 centimeters, in a valley where the air was 34, and the sky was -20. It's respiring, June said. It's a heterotroph running an enormous metabolism, and it's dumping the waste heat into the ground. That's what the satellite is seeing. It's not geothermal, it's thermogenic, it's warm because it's working. I asked how big something would have to be to do that. She sat back on her heels and looked at the valley, the mile of it, the fingers running up the drainage, the steam. She said, "This isn't a colony. Colonies don't do this." I said I didn't know what that meant. She said, "I mean, I don't think there are a lot of them down there. I think there's one." We found the caribou at about 2:10, with maybe 50 minutes of light left, when we moved a half-mile up the valley to a second sampling site. I saw the shapes first and thought they were rocks, and then thought they were willows, and then my brain did the thing where it resorts a scene and I stopped the machine. There were 61 animals. I counted them twice on the photographs afterward and got 61 both times. They were standing on the bare ground in the wide part of the valley, and they were arranged. I want to be as careful with this description as I have been with everything else, because this is the image people fixate on, and it is also the one I have the hardest time keeping honest, since I have now seen it in dreams roughly 400 times in Dreams Edit. The photographs show the following: 61 caribou, cows, calves, 3 bulls, a mixed winter aggregation, entirely normal in composition. They were not clustered. They were distributed across roughly 8 acres at intervals that averaged between 11 and 14 meters, and the intervals were regular enough that when June later plotted their positions from the images, she found the mean nearest neighbor distance was 12.4 meters, with a standard deviation of 1.1. Caribou do not do that. Caribou aggregate in clumps at feeding, string out in lines when traveling, and bunch tightly when threatened. A regular lattice, evenly spaced, is not a behavior in the ethological literature for any ungulate on Earth. It is a behavior of orchards. Every one of them was facing northeast. Not one of them was moving. We watched them for 11 minutes before either of us spoke. I timed it because June asked me to, and because timing it gave me something to do. In 11 minutes, no ear rotation, no tail flick, no weight shift, no head movement, no vapor at any nostril that I could see through the glass at 90 yards, and no reaction whatsoever to 2 idling 2-stroke engines that had come over the rise directly upwind of them. There is no such thing as a wild caribou that does not react to a snow machine at 90 yards. It is the single most reliable behavior in that entire ecosystem. They react at 2 miles. June said quietly, "Are they dead?" I said no. I said I'd been here before, and no. We shut the machines off and walked in. They were in superb condition. That is the detail I want to hammer, because everything about this reads as a horror story, and the animals were the healthiest caribou I have ever seen in my life. Deep fat over the rump, full winter coats without a rub mark. Calves that were, by December standards, enormous. I have counted enough winter calves in that country to know what a good one looks like, and these were better than good. They were fat, and calves in December are not fat. Calves in December are the thing that starves first. Not one of them had a botfly scar. Not one had the crusted nostrils of a warble infestation. In a herd of 61 Alaskan caribou, you should be able to find 40 animals with visible parasite damage. I found none. I walked up to a cow at about 4 feet and stood there and looked at her. Her eyes were open, clear, and wet. Her pupils responded when I moved my hand across her field of view. A slow constriction, delayed by about a second and a half, but it happened. Her rib cage rose and fell once in the time I stood there, which was a bit over 2 minutes. Her body was warm. Her hooves were down in the wet, dark ground, sunk in an inch or so, and around each hoof the soil was disturbed in a small ring, as if something had been packed up around it. June crouched and pulled the soil away from a hind foot with her fingers. She said, "Delia." I got down beside her. The filaments were on the animal. They came up out of the mat, and they were wrapped around the pastern in a dense white sleeve about 3 inches wide. And where they contacted the hoof wall and the skin above it, they went from white to a translucent amber, and they were not attached like something growing over a dead thing. They were flat against the skin, following its contours, dozens of separate cords converging into a broad ribbon that ran down into the ground. The cow did not react to being touched. She did not react when June, very slowly, worked a scalpel under the edge of the sleeve and separated a single filament and lifted it. It came away wet, and there was a very small bead of blood at the point where it had let go. June sat back on her heels in the steam with a filament held in a forceps and her breath going out in a cloud, and she said, in a voice I had not heard her use, "It's plumbed into her." I asked whether it was killing her. June looked at the fat cow with the shining coat and the wet, clear eye, in the 8th fattest condition I had ever seen an animal in on the 12th day of an interior December, standing in a warm valley in an even lattice with 60 other animals in the middle of the worst month of the year, and she said, "Delia, I think it's keeping her. We should have left. I want to state plainly that we should have left, that I was the one with the authority to end the day, and that I did not use it. We had 30 minutes of usable light. We had a 14-mile ride home in the dark on a broken trail, which is unpleasant but entirely routine. The correct call was to shoot 2 more photographs, log the coordinates, and go, and come back on the 14th with a plan and a satellite check-in schedule and 3 more people. Instead, I said, "Show me the middle." I said it, not June. I have listened to people over the years assume that the scientist dragged the ranger deeper in, and it is the reverse, and I would like it corrected. June Alvarado had spent the previous 40 minutes on her knees in a hole and had not once looked up the valley. I was the one who kept looking up the valley, because I'd spent 2 months being followed by a sound, and I had finally arrived somewhere that it was coming from, and I wanted to see it. We walked. We left the machines. That was the second bad decision, and it was also mine. The valley floor rose very slightly toward the northeast, and as we walked, the mat became continuous, no soil showing at all, just a floor of white gold filament springy underfoot, wet, with our boots leaving prints that filled slowly with clear water. The temperature came up. At the caribou, it had been 34. 400 yards up, it was 48, and I opened my parka, and then I took it off and carried it, in December, 15 miles from a village where the recorded low that night was -36. The steam thickened. Visibility dropped to maybe 60 yards. The light was going blue, and then the ground began to move. I'm going to describe this exactly once and then leave it alone. It was not a tremor. It was not seismic. It was a slow, broad, coordinated rise and fall of the surface across everything I could see, with an amplitude I estimated at 4 to 6 inches and a period of about 11 seconds. The mat lifted, held, and settled. Small fissures opened along the crests of the rise as it swelled, clean-edged, an inch or two wide, showing darker material underneath, and closed again as it went down. Water squeezed up out of the fissures when they closed and ran in thin sheets and vanished. 11 seconds. Rise, hold, settle, rise, hold, settle. June had a hand on my arm. I don't remember her taking it. She said, "It's not breathing. Don't say breathing. It's a pressure cycle in a saturated medium, it's..." And then she stopped, because we had both realized at the same moment that we could hear it. Not feel it, hear it. Down there in the steam, in the warm. We were inside the sound at last, and it was not below hearing anymore. It was a low, wide, structureless tone, somewhere around 20 hertz, so deep that it arrived in the chest before the ears, and it went up and down with the cycle of the ground, and it was the thing I had been standing outside my station listening to at 11 o'clock at night for 6 weeks. I had spent those 6 weeks constructing rational explanations for a sound I could not hear. I want to tell you what it is like to arrive at the source of that sound and find that it is a valley the size of a small town, made of one organism, moving. I sat down. I did not decide to. My legs put me on the ground, and the ground was warm and soft and gave under me like a mattress, and it was 48 degrees and I had been cold for 2 months in the constant low-grade way you are always cold in an Alaskan winter even when you are warm, and the relief of it was total. It came up through my legs and my back. It was not a nice feeling. It was a much bigger feeling than nice. It was the feeling of a debt being paid. June said my name. I heard her the way you hear someone in another room. I remember thinking very clearly and with total contentment that I would answer her in a minute. Then she hit me, open-handed, hard, across the side of the face, and she got a fistful of my parka and hauled backward with everything she had, and she was screaming, "Don't lie down, don't lie down, don't lie down." And she was crying, which I did not learn until much later that she had been doing, because I did not see her face for another minute. I got up. My legs worked. I was physically completely fine. Better than fine, warm and rested, my knee that had ached since 2004 not aching. I looked at where I had been sitting, and there was an impression of me in the mat, filling with water. And around the edges of the impression the filaments were standing up. Not lying flat. Standing. Erect off the surface, 3 or 4 inches. Thousands of them. In a ring following the outline of where my body had been, all of them oriented inward. They had done that in under 90 seconds. We were going. There was no discussion. We were 40 minutes from full dark. We were 400 yards from the machines with our helmets off and my parka on the ground, and both of us had crossed some interior line at the same instant. We got about 60 yards. Then the light came on. Under the mat, ahead of us and to the left, a section of the ground perhaps 30 yards across began to glow. It was faint at first, and then it was not faint. It was a cold, greenish white, the exact quality of the light you get off certain marine dinoflagellates, and it did not come from a point. The whole area lit at once, evenly, from beneath the surface, so that the filament floor became translucent, and you could see the structure inside it, the cords and bundles running away like veins in a leaf. Bioluminescence in fungi is not remarkable. There are 80-some species that do it. June said that out loud several times in a tone of voice that was not the tone of a person who found it reassuring. The patch went dark. Then it lit again. Then a second patch, further up the valley, lit and went dark. Then a third, off to the right, much larger. Then 2 at once. I understood what I was looking at about 4 seconds before June said it. It was the pulse. It was the thing I had counted with my ear against the snow on November 27th, 7 miles from here. 3, pause, 2, pause, 5. Except now I could see it, and it was not 325. It was vastly more complicated than that. The November pulse had been the equivalent of hearing a single word of a conversation through a wall. We stood in the steam and watched it for June's camera timestamps put it at 4 minutes and 40 seconds. The patterns were not regular. They did not repeat. Groups of flashes were separated by pauses of varying length, and the groups varied in size from 1 to about 9, and the spatial position of the flashing regions moved in ways that were not random and were not periodic. June, who had a background in information theory from an undergraduate degree she never used, went through the footage frame by frame for 6 weeks afterward and calculated the entropy of the flash sequence and found that it sat in the range typical of structured natural signal, well above the entropy of a metronome and well below the entropy of noise. Right in the range where human language sits. She never published that. I'll come back to it. While we were watching, the caribou turned around, all 61 of them, in a body without a sound, in the space of perhaps 2 seconds. I did not see it happen because I was facing up valley. I heard June make a noise and I turned, and where there had been a lattice of animals facing northeast, there was now a lattice of animals facing southwest, facing us. They did not approach, they did not display, they did not vocalize. They stood in their even spacing, 61 caribou, heads up, ears forward, absolutely still, and looked at the two of us. I have been charged by a grizzly at 11 yards. I have been in a boat in the sound and weather that I did not expect to come out of. Neither of those is in the same category as this. Those were events happening to me. This was a thing noticing me, and doing it. I understood immediately, and without any capacity to argue myself out of it, through 61 borrowed pairs of eyes. I want to be careful. Here is what I can defend. The animals turned in unison at the same moment without any stimulus either of us perceived, and oriented on our position, and remained oriented on our position for the entire time we were retreating, and the herd was on the far side of a rise from us for the last 100 yards, and when I looked back from the top of that rise through binoculars, they had rotated again to track us. Here is what I cannot defend, and what I believe. It was not looking at us. It was looking at the fact of us. It had, somewhere in whatever it uses for a process, arrived at the recognition that there was a novel thing in its country, and it had allocated attention. There is a particular animal experience of being the object of attention from something much larger, and every human being has it available at the base of the spine, even if they have never used it. Mine came online in that valley, and it has never entirely gone offline since. We got to the machines. I got my parka. June had, at some point that neither of us could reconstruct, put a filament sample in a vial, and the vial in her chest pocket, and she checked for it 4 times on the ride home. We ran the trail west in full dark with the headlights making a tunnel, and I did not once look behind me because I was aware that if I looked behind me, I would keep looking. At the stake line, I stopped. I don't know why. I sat there at idle with the light on the row of orange-topped lath and the cold coming back into my hands, and after a moment June pulled up beside me and shut her machine off, so I shut mine off. It was -31. The sky had cleared and the whole northern half of it was moving. I said, "It's not on this side." June said, "What?" I said the sound. I said, "Listen." Behind us, the way we'd come, the air was loaded, and on the west side of that line toward town, there was nothing. Ordinary silence. Ordinary, dead, black, empty interior silence, the best sound in the world. We were 900 yards from the edge of the thermal signature. There is no physical mechanism by which infrasound stops at a line. June said, "That's the survey line. Somebody drew that." I said I knew. She said, "Somebody in 1974 drew a line in exactly the right place." I said the stakes were older than that. I said the stakes were where they were because a surveyor had asked somebody from Anvelac where to put the corner, and somebody from Anvelac had told him. We got home at 9:40. I called in my check-in 3 hours and 40 minutes late, which triggered nothing because Toby Anagic had told the trooper post that we were fine, which he had no way of knowing. He was sitting in his truck outside the station with the engine running when we pulled in. He looked at us for a long moment through the windshield. Then he rolled the window down about 4 inches and said, "You both walking?" I said we were. He said, "Okay." And he put the truck in gear. And then he stopped and rolled the window down the rest of the way and said the only thing he ever said to me on the subject that sounded like anger. He said, "You had a dog that told you." We did not go back out for 9 days, and I want to account for those 9 days honestly, because in retrospect they were the only period in the entire affair when a different outcome was available. The first 3 days we worked. June had samples, soil, mat tissue, the filament from the cow, the vial, and a microscope, and a station kitchen that became a laboratory. She was up until 2 and 3 in the morning every night. I did paperwork and station maintenance and made food and got in her way. What she found, in the order she found it, the filament sample from the cow's pastern contained caribou blood cells, not smeared on it, inside it. Individual hyphae had penetrated capillary structures, and the interior of the filaments contained intact erythrocytes and, more troublingly to her, intact leukocytes, which should have been attacking. There was no inflammatory response in the tissue she'd taken. None. The animal's immune system was not fighting this, it was not even noticing it. The mat tissue would not stop growing. She had it in a sealed container at room temperature in a kitchen in a village at 73 degrees north. Well, 64, but it might as well be. And it doubled in 4 days on nothing. No substrate. She added nothing to it. She weighed it daily and it gained mass, and the only inputs available to it were the air in the jar. And she noted in her log with 3 question marks, the light from the kitchen window, of which there was 4 hours a day. The DNA, she couldn't sequence it in Anvilac, but she could do enough with the field kit to know that a standard fungal primer set did not amplify it. Neither did the bacterial set. She ran the controls 3 times. On the 4th day, she stopped working and got quiet, and on the 5th day, she said at the kitchen table, "I need to tell you what I think, and I need you to not react for 2 minutes." I said, "All right." She said, "I don't think it's a fungus. I think fungus is what we're going to call it in the paper because there's a category, and it fits the category the way a bat fits the category bird if you've never seen a mammal. I think it's older than the category. I think it has been down there under the permafrost, at very low metabolic rate, for a period of time I'm not going to guess at out loud, and I think the reason it's expanding at 9% a year is that the ground is warming, and it has more room every year, and it is coming back. I think it does not eat animals. I think it tends them. I think it captures large mammals in the fall, drops them into a controlled hypometabolic state, plumbs them, keeps them warm and hydrated and free of parasites through the worst of the winter, and releases them in the spring. And I think the reason those calves are fat is that it feeds them. Whatever it's doing at that hoof interface goes both directions, and I think it gets something out of it. Nothing does this for free. I think it gets movement. It can't go anywhere. It's an immobile organism in a place with an 8-month winter and no vectors. So it borrows legs. It takes 60 animals. It keeps them alive and healthy and improve through the season. And when it lets them go in April, they walk 200 miles across western Alaska with its material on them and in them, and inside their gut. And every one of those animals is a seed dispersal event. She stopped. I did not react for 2 minutes as instructed. Then I said, "And the people?" June said, "What people?" I said, "Toby's uncle. Sat on his sled for 11 days. Came home warm and fine and never spoke about it and lived 30 more years and was, by his nephew's account, the calmest man in the village." June did not say anything. I said, "It kept him." She said, "We don't know that." I said, "It kept him, and it let him go, and it improved him. And he knew it. And he spent 30 years telling young men to come back before the ground goes." June got up and went to the window and stood there with her arms folded for a while, looking east at nothing, because at 3 in the afternoon in December there is nothing. She said, "If that's true, then it's had a very long time to learn what we are." I said, "Yes." She said, "And it let us walk out." That was the 5th day. I have gone back to the 5th day more than to any other part of this. That was the last conversation in which both of us were on the same side of the line. June went back without me on the morning of December 20th. I have been asked by the two people who ever officially asked me anything about this whether I authorized it. The answer is that I did not authorize it and I did not forbid it, and that the difference between those two things is a distinction I have had 11 years to become comfortable with, and have not. Here is what happened. On the 18th, she told me she wanted to establish a fixed observation position on the western ridge above the valley, outside the thermal boundary, outside the mat on frozen ground, with a time-lapse camera and a data logger. That was a reasonable plan. It was, in fact, the correct plan. It was what I would have proposed. Ridge position, no descent, no contact, instrument the thing and let it run. I said I'd go with her on the 22nd after the solstice, when I had the Kigalik shelter inspection done in a weather window I liked. She said the 22nd was fine. On the morning of the 20th, I got up at 6:30 and her machine was gone and there was a note on the table. The note said, "Ridge only, not going down. Camera plus logger plus thermal, back by 4. Sorry, the window's today and you know it. J." She was right that the window was that day. -18, clear, dead calm, and a system coming in on the 21st that ended up shutting the village down for 2 days. I want to say what I did, in order. I raised her on the VHF at 7:05 and she answered, and we had a short and extremely cold conversation in which I told her that solo winter travel past the boundary was prohibited under her research authorization. And she told me that she was 53 years old and had done 400 days of solo winter fieldwork, and that she was on a ridge, on frozen ground, with a satellite messenger, and that I could either spend the day being angry or I could take a check-in from her every hour on the hour. I took the check-in schedule. That was the deal I made, and I made it because I was angry, and because I was, and this is the part I do not get to put down, relieved not to be going. She checked in at 8, at 9, at 10, at 11. At 11, she said the ridge position was established, both instruments running, and that the valley floor had extended 900 meters northeast since the 11th. 9 days. 900 meters. She did not check in at 12. She did not check in at 1. At 1:15, I called Toby Anagik and told him I needed a second machine and a second person on the trail east, and he said no. I said, "Toby." He said, "I'll take you to the stakes. I'll wait at the stakes as long as you want. I won't go past them and neither will anybody else here, and you already know that, and I'm not going to argue with you about it while you're gearing up." He was at my shed in 11 minutes. We ran east with about 2 hours of light. We did not talk. At the stake line, Toby stopped and turned his machine around to face west and shut it off and got a thermos out and sat on the seat, and I went past him, and in the mirror I could see him sitting there in the last of the light with his back to the east, not watching me go. He waited 4 hours and 10 minutes. I found her machine on the western ridge exactly where she'd said, parked properly, skis turned, cover on. The time-lapse camera was running. The data logger was running. Her pack was there, closed. Her satellite messenger was in the top pocket of the pack, powered on, with an unsent message drafted at 11:41 that said only anomalous sequence, recording, and stopped. Her snowshoe tracks went down off the ridge into the valley in a straight line. I followed them. It was 3:10 and I had maybe 40 minutes. The valley had changed in 9 days in a way I did not have the vocabulary for. Where the bare ground had ended at a hard melt line, it now ended in a broad fringe of collapsed rotten snow 50 yards wide, and the mat had come up through it in fingers and tongues. The steam was thicker. The temperature at the floor was 51, and the entire surface of the mat, everywhere I could see, was faintly, continuously luminous in the blue dark of a December afternoon. Not flashing, not sequenced, just lit, the way a city is lit from an airplane. Her tracks went 400 yards up the valley, and I found her 60 yards from the caribou. She was lying on her back on the mat with her arms at her sides. Her parka was folded, squared, deliberately, beside her. Her hat was on top of it. She was wearing a fleece in one glove. Her face was up, and her eyes were closed, and she had a small, entirely relaxed expression that I have seen on exactly 2 other faces in my life. Both of them people asleep in a chair in a warm room. The mat had come up over her. Not much. That is what I need you to understand about the timing, and it is the only piece of luck in this entire account. She had been down there for approximately 3.5 hours, and in 3.5 hours the filaments had risen and closed over her boots to the ankle, over her hands to the wrist, and in a thin, even lacy sheet across her back and shoulders and the back of her skull, so that when I got a grip under her arms and pulled, she came up out of an impression of herself with a sound like Velcro and 100,000 threads let go all at once. She was warm. Her pulse was 31. Her respiration was 5 a minute. Her pupils were reactive. She did not wake up. I got her over my shoulder. She weighed about 130, and I have never in my life been so grateful for a small person. And I walked 400 yards back down that valley with her, and the ground rose and fell under me on its 11-second cycle the whole way, and the caribou turned to watch us go, and about halfway to the ridge the light beneath me went out. All of it. The entire valley floor at once, in an instant, dark. I don't know what that meant. I have decided for my own purposes that it did not mean anything hostile, because it did not stop me, and it could have. It could have stopped me by doing nothing at all, by simply keeping hold of her ankles. It did not. She woke up on the ridge while I was getting her into the sled bag, and she was immediately completely lucid, which the flight nurse in Nome later told me was the strangest single detail in the entire medical record. She said, "What time is it?" I said 3:45 and that we were leaving. She said, "Delia, I have to tell you something before I have time to decide not to." I said, "Tell me in the sled." And she said it anyway. Lying in a rescue bag on a ridge at -19 with her hands shaking from adrenaline and not from cold, because she was not cold. She was the only warm thing on that ridge. She said, "I went down to get a sample from the flashing zone. I was going to be 20 minutes. And I got down there and the sequence started, and it was Delia. It was different than the 11th. It was slower. It was much slower, and the groups were shorter, and it kept repeating a 5-flash cluster with a long pause, over and over, maybe 40 times, and I stood there and I thought, it's talking to a thing that can't hear it. It's been broadcasting into a valley of caribou for 10,000 years. And then 2 things came in that look back. And on the 11th it tried at full rate and we ran. And on the 20th it slowed down. It slowed down for me. She started crying, which she did not do, and she said I sat down to watch it. That's all I did. I sat down to watch the pattern and I was going to get up. June Alvarado was medevaced from Anvilac on the morning of December 22nd, after the storm broke, to Norton Sound Regional in Nome, and then to Fairbanks. Her medical findings, which she gave me permission to describe: mild dehydration, core temperature on arrival 99.1, which is not hypothermia, which is the opposite of hypothermia, cortisol at the bottom of the reference range, inflammatory markers uniformly low, a complete blood count that her physician described in the chart as I want to be accurate about why, because the easy version on the cover-up, a suppression, a man in a suit, is not what happened, and the truth is worse and more ordinary. She submitted a paper in June of 2013, a careful one, on the thermal anomaly and the soil microbiology, with the imagery and the temperature series and the growth data, and with the biological material described in the most conservative possible terms as an unclassified thermogenic microbial consortium. She left out the caribou. She left out the flashing. She left out herself. It was rejected twice. The second reviewer wrote that the temperature data were almost certainly instrumental error because the values described were not physically plausible for a biological system at that latitude, and the alternative explanation, an unmapped geothermal feature, was far more parsimonious. He was applying the correct default assumption. He was doing his job. That is how this works. She rewrote it and got a version published in 2015 in a soil science journal with a small readership, framed as a preliminary description of a geothermal-associated microbial community. And it has been cited 11 times, all of them by people studying something else. The full data set, the video, the lattice, the entropy analysis, the medical record, the 80 pages of field notes, sits on 2 hard drives, one in Palmer and one in a fire safe in my station. She told me, in 2016, why she stopped pushing. She said, "Delia, think about what happens if I win. If I win, I get 8 helicopters in that valley by the following July. I get a bioprospecting consortium, because the thing that interests industry about an organism that puts a large mammal into controlled hypometabolic stasis with no immune response is not the ecology. I get 140 scientists, and I get a road, and I get somebody drilling it to see how deep it goes, and I get a village of 370 people who have kept a functioning relationship with this thing for I don't know how many centuries turned into a footnote and a lawsuit. And that's if I win clean. That's the good outcome." I said the science mattered. She said, "The science does matter. It matters more than almost anything I can think of. And I have decided I would rather be a coward about the most important thing I ever found than be the reason it gets cut open. Those are the 2 options I've got. I don't like either one." In February, after the dark had bottomed out and started back, Toby and Nagic came over one night with a bag of frozen fish and sat at my table and told me about the Rangers, because I had earned it, or because he had decided the information was now less dangerous in my head than out of it. There had been 6 of us since the station was built in 1979. Wendell Sorbo, 1979 to 1983. Went out east in his first winter. Came back. Requested and received permanent assignment to Anvilak and stayed until he died in 1994, 11 years past retirement eligibility, in a house 400 yards from where I was sitting. He is buried on the hill behind the church. Owen Kittredge, 1988. One winter. Transferred to Ohio in the spring, and according to a colleague of mine who knew him later, never spoke about Alaska again in 20 years. Not once, not even when asked directly. A woman named Ann Feld, 1994. One winter. Resigned from the service in April. 2 more in the 90s and 2000s who I will not name because their families are alive and did not consent to being in this. One winter each. Gerald Pike, 2010 to 2011. 7 months. Requested a hardship transfer in March. Retired 4 months after coming out. Toby said Pike had come to his house on his last night in the village and stood in the Arctic entry with his hat in his hands and said, "How do you live here?" And Toby said he had told him the truth, which is, "Same as anybody, you stay on your side." 6 Rangers in 33 years, 19 months of vacancy before me. Not one of them went to a supervisor with anything, because there is nothing in the Federal Register about this and no form to put it on, and because everybody who saw it correctly understood the first rule of the situation, which is that the only thing worse than not being believed is being believed. I asked Toby why the village had never said anything to any of them. He said, "We told all of you the same thing. Don't go past the stakes in winter." I said that wasn't an explanation. Toby said, "It's the whole explanation. You just wanted a story attached to it so you could decide whether to believe it. The people here don't need the story. They need the rule." Then he said the thing I have repeated more often than anything else anyone said to me in Alaska. He said, "You know why we can live next to it and you can't? Because we're not trying to find out what it is. We already know what it is. It's the thing east of the stakes." That's a complete answer, if you're not the kind of person who needs it to be a different kind of answer. I asked him, finally, after 5 months, whether it had ever hurt anyone. Toby thought about it for a long time. He said, "Not the way you mean." Then he said, "But nobody who lies down out there comes back the same. Not worse. My uncle wasn't worse. He was..." And he stopped, and he moved his hand in the air like a man trying to shape something. He was finished, like he'd stopped being in a hurry about being alive. 41 years old and finished. He looked at me across the table. He said, "You sat down." I said yes. He said, "For how long?" I said maybe 90 seconds, maybe 2 minutes. Toby Anagic nodded slowly and said, "That's why you're still here." The dark came back in January and February the way it does, and I did my job. I inspected the Kigali shelter. I ran the western drainages. I did school visits. I did a search and rescue with Toby in March for 2 boys on a broken-down machine who were exactly where everyone said they'd be and were fine and were extremely embarrassed. I did not go east. I want to say that I did not go east because of a considered professional judgment, and there is some truth to that. There is also the fact that in the middle of January I woke up at 3 a.m., 6 nights in a row, already dressed to go, standing in the mud room with my hand on the door, with no memory of getting up. I put a padlock on the shed and gave the key to Priscilla Uyak and told her not to give it back to me between the hours of 8 p.m. and 6 a.m. for any reason short of a rescue call. She took the key without asking a single question. She had a hook by her door with a key already on it, an older key, dull with handling. I did not ask. The nights stopped. In late March, the thermal signature began to shrink. I could see it in the imagery June sent every week, and I could see it from a ridge 9 miles out with binoculars on a clear day in April. The steam thinning, the bare ground drawing back, the fingers up the drainage retracting. By the first week of May, at breakup, it was down to about 40 acres from 400, and the surface was covered again with normal soil and normal moss and normal patches of old rotten snow. And the sound, which I had felt every still night for 6 months without admitting it, stopped over a period of about 9 days like a machine winding down, and the caribou walked out. I watched it from the ridge on May 4th. They came southwest down the drainage in a loose string. 60-some animals with a scatter of others joined on, moving at an unhurried walk, and they crossed the second creek and went past the stake line and out into the ordinary world. And every one of them was fat, and the calves, the yearlings by then, were the biggest yearlings I have ever seen in that country by a margin that is not subtle. I photographed them. I put it in my annual report as an anomalous overwinter survival and condition observation for the two-lion herd, with numbers, no adjectives, and no location narrower than Eastern Unit. It got cited 3 times in state harvest management documents. Somebody at Fish and Game wrote a paragraph hypothesizing an unusually favorable microclimate in the eastern drainages producing exceptional forage availability. That is the closest this thing has ever come to appearing in the scientific literature, and it is, I want to point out, entirely correct. I extended in June of 2013. Doug Farrar was pleased and slightly puzzled, and asked if I was sure, and I said I liked the country, and he wrote it up, and that was the whole conversation. I have been the resident ranger at Anvilac for 11 years. I am the only one who has ever done a second winter. Toby is right about why, because I sat down for 90 seconds and got hauled up, which turns out to be exactly the wrong dose. Long enough to know, short enough to be able to keep living on this side of the line. The ones who never sat down could not tolerate knowing it was there and unresolved, and they went, 1 winter each, every one of them. Wendell Sorbo lay down for God knows how long and could never make himself leave. And June Alvarado lay down for 3.5 hours and got pulled out, and is fine, and grows enormous vegetables in Palmer, and has never once come back, and she is the only person in this account who I think made a fully free choice. I stayed for a reason I did not have words for until about year 4. Somebody has to be here who knows, not to guard it. You cannot guard a 400-acre organism with 1 ranger and a snow machine, and it does not need guarding from anything except the arrival of people who want to know what it is. My entire function, the actual unwritten job I have been doing for 11 years, in exchange for a GS-9 salary and a station with a bad furnace, is to be the person who receives the reports. Because they come in. A pilot sees steam in January and mentions it. A hunter from downriver crosses a line of tracks that stop. A graduate student pulls the MODIS record for Western Alaska for a class project and writes to the regional office asking about a hot spot. 3 or 4 times a year, somebody notices. And it comes to me because I am the ranger for that unit, and I write back a courteous and factually accurate reply describing an unmapped geothermal expression in a remote drainage with difficult winter access, and I attach the 2015 paper, and I offer to answer any further questions, and there are almost never any further questions. I have thought a great deal about whether that makes me a liar. I have concluded that it does. I have also concluded that I would do it again, and that the two conclusions are allowed to sit next to each other. Here is what I actually worry about, and it is not what people expect. It is not that it will come for the village. It has had 10,000 years, and it has never come for the village. And I no longer believe it wants anything from us at all in the sense that want is usually meant. June's word for it was courteous, which sounds insane until you have stood in a valley and had a thing the size of a town slow down its speech for you. What I worry about is the number, 9% a year. That was the growth rate from 1998 to 2012. I have the imagery for every year since. From 2013 to 2019, it averaged 11. Since 2020, it has averaged 14, and last winter the thermal signature covered 1,100 acres, and the northeastern fingers reached over the low divide into the Kagalik drainage for the first time in the record. It is not doing anything. It is not deciding anything. It is simply an organism that spent an unimaginable amount of time compressed into a thin, warm seam under a lid of permafrost. And the lid is coming off, and it is going back to the size it used to be. The stake line was drawn by somebody from Anvilak who knew exactly where the edge was in 1974. The edge is now 3.5 miles east of the stakes on the north side, and it moves every year, and I have not told anyone this, and there is no correct person to tell. And every June I go out with a GPS and a hand auger, and I walk the boundary myself, and mark it in a notebook that is not a federal record. Toby Anagik died in 2021. He was 74. Before that, for about 3 years, he and I walked it together. The last time we did it, at the end of a long day, he sat down on his machine and looked east at the country going gold and said, "You'll have to tell somebody eventually." I said, "Who?" He said, "Somebody from here, a young one. It has to be somebody who's going to stay." I asked how you pick, and Toby Anagik said, "You don't. You just say the rule to all of them every fall and see which one asks why. Nobody lasts more than one winter at the Anvilak station. That is a true statement, and it has been true since 1979, and it will probably be true again after me, and the people who repeat it always mean it as a story about the dark or the cold, or the isolation, or the specific way an 8-month winter takes a person apart. It isn't about any of that. It is about the fact that 14 miles east of a village with a post office and a basketball court, there is something enormous and old and patient and awake under the ground, and it is warm, and it is coming back, and it will take one winter for you to find out, and after that there are only 2 things left to do, and leaving is the easier of them. I am filing this because I am 53 years old and I have started to think about who receives the reports after me. If you are the one who ends up in that station, the rule is real. Come back before the ground goes. And whatever else happens out there, whatever it shows you, however warm it is, however much you want to, do not lie down. I have told this story exactly twice. Once in a deposition room in Reno in March of 2010, where I was asked to keep my answers responsive to the questions, and once to a priest in Elko who was kind to me and who did not believe a word of it. Both times I left out the middle. The middle is the part that matters, and the middle is the part that sounds like a woman coming apart. So I gave them the beginning and the end and let them make of it what they wanted. I am 68 years old now. I do not have a career left to protect. The people who could have been hurt by this are dead, and the people who should have been hurt by it were never going to be. So there is no reason left to keep quiet except habit, and habit is not a reason. I want to start with the day I understood I had been wrong about the shape of the world for 51 years. It was September 9th, 2009, at approximately 6:15 in the morning, and I was parked on the shoulder of a 2-track road on the eastern rim of Pale Horse Basin, drinking coffee out of a thermos lid and counting pronghorn. That was actual work, by the way. People assume the counting is something rangers do to look busy. It is not. Pronghorn numbers in the basin had been in a slow decline since the mid-90s, and the state wildlife people wanted our informal counts to cross-check against their aerial surveys. So twice a week in the fall, I sat on that rim at dawn with binoculars and a clipboard, and I counted animals, and I liked the work, because it was quiet, and it required nothing of me except attention. There were 58 of them that morning, spread across maybe a mile and a half of flat, working through the rabbit brush in that scattered, unhurried way pronghorn have when nothing is wrong. Some grazing, some standing, 2 young bucks doing a half-serious shoving match near a dry wash. Ordinary. I had been watching that same herd more or less for 11 years. The sun was not up over the rubies yet, but the light was coming. That gray-blue light that makes the sage look like water. It was cold, maybe 38 degrees. There was no wind at all, which I noted because in Pale Horse Basin there is nearly always wind, and its absence is the kind of thing you register without knowing why. Then every animal in the herd stopped moving. I want to be careful in how I describe this, because it is the hinge that everything else swings on, and if I describe it badly, you will file it under startled animals and stop listening. When pronghorn are alarmed, the alarm travels. One animal catches something, a scent, a movement, and it goes rigid, and the animals nearest it notice and go rigid, and you can watch the alertness spread outward across the herd like a ring on water. It takes 2-3 seconds to cross a group that size. You can see it move. I had watched it happen 1,000 times. This was not that. There was no ring, no spread, no first animal. 58 pronghorns spread across a mile and a half of open ground lifted their heads at the same instant. Not nearly the same instant. The same instant. Grazing animals, standing animals, the 2 bucks mid-shove, all of them at once. Heads up, bodies turned to face north-northwest, toward the low black ridge that separated the basin from the flats beyond it. And then they held. That is the part I still see when I close my eyes. My name is Della Marchetti. In September of 2009, I was 51 years old, a GS-9 wilderness ranger with the Bureau of Land Management, assigned to the Pale Horse Field Office in northeastern Nevada. I had been in that office 11 years, which was longer than anyone else on the staff except the realty specialist, and considerably longer than any of the 4 field managers I outlasted. I need to tell you who I was, because later on I am going to describe things that will make you want to know whether I was reliable, and it is better if you can decide that early. I grew up in Winnemucca. My father drove a water truck for a mining outfit, and my mother taught 4th grade for 31 years. I got a 2-year degree in range science at Great Basin College, worked seasonal fire for 4 summers, and then took a permanent job with the Bureau in 1983 because it had a pension, and because I discovered I would rather be alone outdoors than in a room with people. I was married once for 9 years to a good man named Aaron who wanted children in a town, and I gave him neither, and he left without meanness, which I have always been grateful for. There was nobody after that. I had a dog named Pilot for 12 years, and when he died I did not get another one, which my sister took as evidence of something. Nobody who worked with me would have called me imaginative. I want that on the record. I was the person in the office who read the regulations. When the Battle Mountain crew wanted to reroute a trail without doing the cultural survey, I was the one who made them do the cultural survey. I filed my reports on time. I had never in my life had a religious experience, seen a ghost, or believed in one. When our seasonal tech, Robbie Feld, told me in 2006 that he had seen a mountain lion the size of a horse near Fish Creek, I told him that he had seen a mountain lion, and that mountain lions look enormous when you are frightened, and I wrote in my log lion sighting, unremarkable. That was me. My field area was about 400,000 acres of the Eastern District. High desert, cold desert, whatever you want to call it. Sagebrush steppe on the flats, juniper and mountain mahogany on the slopes, aspen pockets in a few of the north-facing draws where the snow lingered. Elevation ran from about 5,200 feet on the basin floor to a little over 9,000 on Cradle Peak. It is not the country people imagine when they hear Nevada. There are no dunes. It is not flat. It is a corrugated place, basin and range, one long north-south valley after another with a wall of mountains between each, repeating out to the horizon like something a machine made. Pale Horse Basin was the middle of my area, and the emptiest part of it. About 30 miles long and 11 wide at its widest, running roughly north-northwest to south-southeast, between the Little Antelopes on the west, and a low unnamed ridge on the east that everyone called the Blacks, because of the color of the rock. Playa in the center, dry 11 months a year. 2 seasonal creeks. 1 spring, at Weems Ranch on the southwest edge. No paved roads, no power lines, no cell coverage, then or now. The nearest town was Del Springs, population 340 at the 2000 census, 41 miles from the field station by dirt and gravel. It had a school that took kids through 8th grade, a bar called the Ace that also sold gasoline, and a Mormon church. My office was in Del Springs in a metal building shared with the fire cache, but I spent most of my working life in a 1997 Ford F-250 with a bureau shield on the door and 190,000 miles on it, and about 60 nights a year in a canvas wall tent or the back of the truck. The only other person I talked to regularly was Hollis Pine. Hollis was 63 that fall. He had been a wildlife biologist with the state for 22 years, and then, after a divorce and something he never fully explained involving a supervisor in Ely, had taken a contract position doing sage grouse-lek surveys that paid about a third of what he was worth. He lived alone in a converted school bus at the edge of a piece of private ground east of the Blacks, and he had a ham setup and a repeater on Cradle Peak, and most evenings around 8 he and I talked on the radio for 10 or 15 minutes about nothing. I want to say something about Hollis now while I can do it plainly. He was the most careful observer I have ever known. He would not tell you a bird was a brewer's sparrow until he was sure, and if he was not sure he said so, and if he had said so and then found out he was right, he did not mention it again. He kept notebooks going back to 1979 in a footlocker under his bed, indexed by year, and he could find any observation in any of them inside 2 minutes. He had a bad hip and a worse temper about paperwork, and he was the only person in my adult life I could sit next to in silence for an hour, without either of us feeling that something needed to be done about it. He is dead now. I will get to that. The last thing I want to establish before I go on is how well I knew that country. Not to boast, because it matters. I knew where the pronghorn wintered and where they fawned. I knew which of the 2 creeks went dry first in a bad year, and I knew that the eastern one, Sawmill Creek, had gone dry in 1988 and again in 2002, and both times had come back. I knew where every wild horse band in the basin watered and roughly how many animals were in each. I knew the location of 41 archaeological sites, of which the state knew about 29. I knew where a Basque sheepherder had carved his name and the year 1913 into an aspen in the Little Antelopes, and I knew where a Cessna had gone down in 1971 and where the pieces still were. And I knew which stretch of the Blacks you could get a truck over and which stretch would tear the transfer case out from underneath you. That basin was the most stable, most legible, most known thing in my life. I trusted it in the way you trust your own kitchen in the dark, which is why what began in September of that year did not frighten me at first. It confused me. And confusion for a person like me is a problem to be worked, and I worked it for 9 weeks with all the patience and method and stubbornness I had. And I want you to understand that every single step I took toward the answer was reasonable and correct, and took me closer to a place I should never have gone. I did what I would have told anybody to do. I wrote it up. The entry in my field log for September 9th reads, in full, 0615-0622, E-rim PHB above Coyote Tank. Antelope, 58 animals. Herd alerted simultaneously, held approx 8 to 10 Seki facing NNW, then ran SSE as a single group, no scatter, no stragglers. Left basin over Sawmill grade. Duration approx 7 min, 'cause not observed. Note, no wind, no birds heard. That last clause I added an hour later, after I had driven down into the basin and spent 40 minutes trying to find whatever had moved that herd. I want to be honest about what I was looking for. I was looking for a cougar, or a pack of dogs. There were feral dogs in that country. 3 of them had been shot near Del Springs in 2007 after killing a calf, or people. Antelope hunting season had opened in August, and it was possible some idiot with a rifle had come up the north end on an ATV and pushed the herd. That was my leading theory, and it was a good one, because it accounted for the direction and the speed. It did not account for the formation, and it did not account for the 8 to 11 seconds of stillness, and it did not account for the fact that I drove the north end of that basin for 40 minutes and found no fresh vehicle track of any kind on ground that holds a tire print for weeks. But it was still my leading theory, when I got back to the station that night, because the alternative was that I did not have a theory, and I was not the sort of person who was comfortable with that. The birds, though, the birds bothered me. Here is the thing that nobody who has not spent thousands of hours alone outdoors will understand. Places have a sound floor, not silence. A floor. Even in cold desert in September, even at dawn, there is a continuous low texture. Horned larks, sage sparrows, ravens somewhere, the tick of insects in the brush, wind in the sage, which is a specific sound, dry and papery and unlike wind in anything else. You do not hear the floor. You hear things that stand out from it. But your nervous system knows it is there, and when it goes, some very old part of you sits up. That morning, standing on that rim in the dark before the light came, there had been no floor. I had noticed it and dismissed it, and then remembered it an hour later with my hand on the truck door. I noted it. I moved on. I had a grazing compliance check scheduled in the Little Antelopes that week and a culvert to look at on the Sawmill Road, and I did those things, and for 4 days, nothing else happened. On September 13th, I found the first one. I was on foot, working a fence line on the east side of the basin about a mile south of Coyote Tank. Somebody's cattle had been getting through, and the permittee said it was our fence, and I said it was his fence, and the way you resolve that is, you walk the fence. It was warm, mid-70s, early afternoon. I was maybe 2 miles from the truck. The mule deer was lying in a shallow swale about 30 yards off the fence line, in the open, in a patch of low rabbit brush. A doe, adult, maybe 4 or 5 years old, in good condition. And I mean genuinely good condition, fat on her, coat slick, nothing wrong with her feet or teeth. She was lying on her side with her legs folded under her the way a deer lies down to rest. There was no wound, not a scratch. No blood on the ground and none in her nostrils or mouth. No claw marks, no punctures, no torn hide, no missing hair. Nothing had fed on her, which after however many days she had been out there was the strangest part of it. No coyote, no raven, no magpie, no eagle, nothing. Her eyes were intact. In that country, a dead animal in the open is a raven's banquet inside of 6 hours, and her eyes were intact. The ground around her was undisturbed. No thrashing, no dug-in hoof marks, no sign that she had struggled or convulsed or gone down hard. Just a deer, lying in the brush, in a place where deer lie down. I put on a nitrile glove. I carried them for handling scat samples, and I checked her over anyway, methodically, the way I would document any mortality. Then I photographed her from 6 angles with the office Nikon, recorded the coordinates, and called it in when I got back in cell range 2 days later. The state wildlife biologist for that region was a woman named Priya Ganguly, who I had worked with for years and liked. She asked the questions you would expect. Was there a lightning scar on a nearby tree? No trees. Poison? No evidence, and we had no bait stations within 40 miles. EHD, epizootic hemorrhagic disease, which shows up in Nevada deer in warm falls. Possible, she said. But EHD deer nearly always die at water, and this animal was 1.5 miles from the nearest water. Anthrax was theoretically possible and functionally absurd. She said if I found another one, she wanted a head and a tissue sample. I found another one on September 21st. Male, this time, a young buck, about 2 miles north of the first, in the same condition. Untouched, unfed upon, no wound, lying in a resting posture in the open. 9 days apart and 2 miles apart, and I stood over that second animal for a long time with a very cold feeling in my stomach. Because 2 is not a coincidence, 2 is a pattern, and I had been in that job long enough to know that the moment you see a pattern, you are already behind it. I took the head. It is an unpleasant job, and I will not describe it. I packed it in a cooler with dry ice from the ACE and drove it 110 miles to the state lab in Elko myself, because I did not trust the male, and I filled out the chain of custody, and I drove home. The lab work came back on October 6th. No EHD, no blue tongue, no anthrax, no plague, no rabies, no chronic wasting, no toxicology hits, No strychnine, no 1080, no organophosphates, no lead, nothing. Liver and kidney values unremarkable. The animal, as far as the pathologist could determine, had been perfectly healthy at time of death. But there were 2 lines in that report that I read 40 or 50 times over the following weeks. The first was under gross findings. The pathologist had noted bilateral hemorrhage in the middle ear, small but present in both ears. She flagged it as consistent with barotrauma, pressure injury, the kind of thing you see in animals near an explosion, or in marine mammals near sonar. The second was in the adrenal analysis. Cortisol was elevated, not slightly. It was, in the pathologist's phrasing, among the highest values observed in this laboratory in a cervid, and she noted that levels of that magnitude were typically seen in animals that had undergone prolonged pursuit, an hour or more of being chased, or a long entanglement in a fence. An animal with no wound and no sign of struggle, lying down in the open as though it had chosen the spot, with blood in both ears and enough stress hormone in its blood to have been running for an hour. I called Priya. She was as baffled as I was. She said the barotrauma finding was almost certainly incidental, an artifact of the field decapitation or the freezing. And I said I had done the extraction carefully, and she said she believed me, and that it was still probably an artifact. She said she would flag it. She said if I found a third one, she would come out herself. She never got the chance because by the time I found the third one, on October 30th, I was not calling anybody anymore. The night after I got the lab results, I told Hollis about all of it on the radio. He listened without interrupting, which was normal for him, and when I finished, he did not say anything for 11 or 12 seconds, which was not. "Say the date of the antelope again," he said. September 9th, around 6:15 in the morning. More silence. Then, Della. On the morning of September 9th, I was at the Cold Springs Lek doing a late-season count, which is a waste of time in September, but they pay me to do it. That's about 9 miles north of your rim, other side of the Blacks. All right. At about 6 in the morning, I had 400 head of horses come through the gap below me. I sat up in my chair. 400. I counted 360, and I know I lost some. That's every band on the north end of that basin and probably some from the Antelope Valley side. Della, those bands do not mix. 16, 17 stallions running their harems within a quarter mile of each other and nobody fighting. Going south, not fast. That's the thing. They weren't running. They were traveling, at a good steady trot, and they did not stop, and there was no dust behind them from anything pushing them. Did you hear anything? That, said Hollis, is why I've thought about it every day since. No. It was dead quiet. 400 horses on hardpan ought to sound like the end of the world, and I remember thinking they sounded muffled, like I was hearing them through a wall. Did you report it? I put it in my notes. Who would I report it to? Wild Horse and Burro program would tell me they're horses and horses move. I told him about the birds. He said that on the morning of the 9th at the Cold Springs Lek, he had recorded. He went and got the notebook while I waited on the radio. No passerine activity. 5:40 to 06:25. 45 minutes of no small birds at a site where he had 40 years of data saying there should be. There's one more thing, he said, and I want you to hear me say I don't know what it means. I've been coming to this basin since 1979. In August of 1994, I sat on the same rim you were on and watched the same herd, or its grandmothers, do the same thing. All at once, all facing north, then gone southeast in a bunch. I wrote it down. I wrote inexplicable in the margin, which I have written in a field notebook exactly twice in my life. 1994, August 22nd, 1994. And Della, I didn't think anything of it for 15 years, but there were 2 dead does that fall on the sawmill side that nobody could account for. The state took one and lost the sample. I remember being annoyed about it. That was the first night I got out the map. It was a 1/100,000 surface management map of the Pale Horse Quadrangle, the kind with the land status color-coded, and I had 4 or 5 of them because I wore them out. I spread it on the kitchen table in the little house the Bureau rented for me in Del Springs, and I marked what I had. The rim where the antelope alerted. The gap where Hollis's horses came through, the 2 dead deer, the Cold Springs Lek, and, because it was the only other thing I had, the spot where I had stood in October of 2008 and heard, for about 4 seconds, a sound I had written up at the time as a low-flying military aircraft, although I never saw one, and although Fallon's ranges are 200 miles southwest of there. 5 points. They did not make a circle around anything. That was what I expected, honestly. You expect a source. You expect the marks to arrange themselves around a center, the way tracks arrange themselves around a kill. They made a line. Not a perfect line. But if you laid a straight edge on that map, from the northwest corner of the quadrangle down through the basin to the southeast, all 5 points fell within about 2 miles of it, and the line ran the long axis of Pale Horse Basin, and every single animal I knew about had moved along it, southeastward, in the same direction, as though they were not fleeing a place but leaving a path. I sat and looked at that line for a while. Then I got up and got the older maps out of the file cabinet, because there was something about the shape of it I half recognized, and I could not think from where. It took me until nearly 1 in the morning to find it. It was on the 1998 Resource Management Plan Land Use Overlay, a big folded map that came with the plan document, showing every allocation and designation in the field office. Grazing allotments, rights-of-way corridors, areas of critical environmental concern, wilderness study areas, mineral withdrawals, the kind of map that nobody looks at except when somebody wants to build something. Running the long axis of Pale Horse Basin, from the northwest corner of the quadrangle to the southeast, was a strip of land about 2.5 miles wide and roughly 31 miles long, cross-hatched in gray, with a small box in the legend that read Category 3, unsuitable for all authorized surface use. No new row, no lease, no permit. See Appendix K. I had worked in that office for 11 years. I had processed rights-of-way applications for 2 power lines, a fiber line, a gravel pit, and a communications site. I had helped write the grazing decisions for 4 allotments in that basin. I had never once heard anyone say the words Category 3, and I had never, not one time in 11 years, been asked to authorize anything inside that strip, which meant that in 11 years, no one had ever proposed anything there, or that if they had, it had been resolved before it ever reached my desk. I looked for Appendix K in the plan document. The plan was 460 pages with 14 appendices. There was no Appendix K. The appendices ran A through J, and then L. I want to be very clear about my state of mind at 1 in the morning on October 7, 2009. I did not think anything supernatural was happening. I thought I had found evidence of a bureaucratic irregularity, possibly a mineral withdrawal that had been classified for some defense-related reason, possibly something to do with a buried cable or an old test site. And I remember thinking this exact thing. Somebody hit a facility in my basin, and the animals can hear it. That theory was wrong. But it was the best theory available on the evidence I had, and I want to record that I reached it honestly, and that for about 3 weeks it made me feel much better. Because a hidden facility is a thing men build, and men can be found and asked. The Pale Horse Field Office Records Room was a windowless space at the back of the metal building, 20 by 30 feet, 4 rows of lateral files, and a shelf of bound plan documents going back to 1964. It smelled like hot dust and toner. The fluorescent light in the northeast corner had a ballast that hummed at a pitch that gave me a headache in under 20 minutes, and I had submitted a work order about it 3 times over 6 years. I spent parts of 4 days in there between October 7th and October 15th. Here is what I was looking for, and here is what I found. The 1998 Resource Management Plan was the current plan. Plans get revised roughly every 15 to 20 years, and each revision carries forward the allocations of the previous one unless somebody actively changes them. So I went backward. The 1981 Management Framework Plan had the same strip, different terminology. It was called a Special Constraint Area, but the same footprint, the same 2.5 by 31 miles, the same long diagonal down the axis of the basin. The stated rationale was one sentence: constraint carried forward per 1971 decision. See decision file. The 1964 plan did not have it. In 1964, that basin had 3 grazing allotments running straight across where the strip would later be, and a proposed reservoir site at the south end, and a note about a potential recreation road. So it began in 1971. I looked for the 1971 decision file. The index card for it existed. Someone had typed PH 71004, decision and supporting documentation, Pale Horse Basin, 2 boxes. The boxes were not there. The shelf location on the card was row 3, shelf D, and row 3, shelf D held boxes labeled PH 71002, PH 71003, and PH 71006. 2 boxes gone, and nothing to say when. I did not immediately conclude anything sinister. Records go missing. Offices flood. In 1994, our office had a water heater fail over a long weekend and lost most of a decade of range files. So I went looking for the same material in other places, which is what you learn to do after 26 years. Nothing exists in only one file. And this is where it started to be strange. The Federal Register notice existed. In 1971, the Bureau would have had to publish a proposed withdrawal or classification. I found it on microfiche at the college library in Elko 2 weeks later. A short notice, dated May 1971, proposing classification of approximately 49,600 acres in Elko County as unsuitable for all forms of authorized surface use in the public interest, with no further explanation, and a 30-day comment period. That was all. There was no accompanying environmental documentation, because NEPA was a year old and nobody knew what they were doing yet. The livestock permits told a better story. The 3 allotments that had crossed that basin were canceled in 1971 and 1972, not reduced, canceled, and the permittees compensated with additional AUMs on ground 20 miles east that was, by any measure, worse country. One of them appealed. The appeal file was intact, and it was 200 pages long, and it went to the Interior Board of Land Appeals, and the permittee lost, and the reasoning in the decision is a masterpiece of saying nothing. The classification was within the Secretary's discretion. The record supported it. The appellant's economic injury was not sufficient to overcome the public interest determination. The permittee's name was Alvin Weems. Weems Ranch was still there on the southwest edge of the basin. Dorcas Weems, his daughter, was 81 years old and still living in the house, and I had been drinking her coffee twice a year for 11 years. I will get to Dorcas. I want to finish the archive first because there was one more thing in that records room. And it was the thing that turned my hidden facility theory into a hidden something else theory, and I want you to see it in the order I saw it. Buried in the 1981 plans correspondence file was a copy of a letter. It was addressed to the district manager, dated August 1979, from a man named Elias Kohut, who identified himself as a research hydrologist with the U.S. Geological Survey, Water Resources Division, Carson City. It was 1 page, and it was written in the flat, aggrieved tone of a scientist who has already lost an argument. Kohut wrote that he had been asked to review the piezometric data from the 4 monitoring wells in the constraint area, and that he was declining to sign the summary as drafted. He wrote that the drafted summary characterized the observed water level fluctuations as seasonal recharge variation, and that he did not agree because the fluctuations were not seasonal, were not correlated with precipitation, and occurred in all 4 wells within intervals too short to be explained by transmissivity in that aquifer material. He wrote that the pattern more closely resembled a pressure pulse, propagating from north-northwest to south-southeast, at a rate he estimated at between 4 and 6 miles per day. Then he wrote a sentence I copied by hand into my notebook and have never forgotten. I am aware that the interpretation is unwelcome, but the data do not care whether we like them, and something is moving through that basin. There was no response letter in the file. There were no monitoring wells in the basin in 2009. I checked the state's well database that night and found 4 wells drilled in 1972 in Pale Horse Basin and abandoned, plugged and abandoned, formally, with paperwork, in 1980. 4 and 6 miles per day. I got out the map again. 31 miles of basin at 5 miles a day is about 6 days. And I sat there with a pencil in my hand at the kitchen table, and I did the arithmetic that any competent person would do, which was, if something entered that basin at the north end and went out the south end at 5 miles a day, and animals cleared out ahead of it, then the animals at the north end would run about 6 days before the animals at the south end. But that was not what happened. On September 9th, every animal in the basin, Hollis's horses 9 miles north of my rim, my antelope on the rim, had moved on the same morning, within an hour or so of each other, unless they had not been running from the thing itself, unless they had been running from the announcement of it, getting out of the way, clearing the road early, the way you get off a highway when you hear a siren, not when you see the truck. That is the thought I had on the night of October 15th, and it is the first thought I had in the whole business that was actually correct, and I did not believe it for another 3 weeks. Dorcas Weems was born in that basin in 1928 and had left it 4 times in her life, twice for surgeries in Salt Lake, once to bury a brother in Idaho, and once, in 1946, for a 2-week trip to San Francisco that she referred to for the rest of her life as when I went. She was a small, upright, unsentimental woman who wore men's work shirts and kept her hair in a braid the color of dirty snow, and she had run cattle by herself for the 18 years after her husband died, and then leased the grazing out and kept the house. Her eyes were sharp. She had a landline and no television and a stack of the Elko Daily Free Press by the stove that she used for kindling after she read it. I drove out there on the afternoon of October 17th with a box of the almond cookies she liked from the market in Wells, which was a 2-hour detour, and I did not tell her why I had come until we had been sitting at her kitchen table for 40 minutes talking about her hip and the price of hay and a neighbor's dogs. Then I said, "Dorcas, I want to ask you about 1971. She was pouring coffee. She did not stop pouring. She finished, set the pot down, and sat. "Which part of it?" she said. "Your father lost his permit." "He did. Do you know why?" Dorcas Weems looked at me across that table for what felt like a long time. She had a way of looking at you that made you feel like a form she was deciding whether to fill out. "They told him the ground was being classified," she said. "He fought it for 2 years, and it cost him $9,000, which in 1972 was a house. He never got a reason he could repeat to another man without sounding foolish. Did he get one he couldn't repeat? That was the question, and I saw her decide. He got told, by a fellow from Reno who came out here in a government car and sat in that chair you're in, that the government had been advised that it wasn't a fit place to keep animals," she said. "And my father said, 'We've kept animals on it for 50 years. And the fellow said, 'Yes, and how have they done?' She let that sit. "And how had they done?" I said. "Badly," said Dorcas. "And that's the part I've never told anybody except my husband, and he thought I was foolish, and I let him." Then she told me about the pulls. That is what her family called them. Not a good word, she said, but the only one they had. Every so often, no pattern anybody could hold on to. She remembered 1934, 1946, 1961, 1971, and she thought there had been one in the 50s that she had been away for. The stock would leave. "Cattle don't leave," she said. "You understand what I'm telling you. Cattle are the stupidest animal God made, and they will stand in a burning corral. But every so often in the fall, the whole herd would go out of that basin in a night, through the fence if the gate was shut, and we'd find them 15, 20 miles southeast, standing in a bunch on somebody else's ground, and they'd have run themselves down. Some of them would have run themselves down to where they never came right again. And the horses were worse." "Worse how?" "The horses went first," she said. "Always. Half a day before the cattle. My mother used to say the horses had the better ears." I asked her what her family thought was happening. "My grandmother was Shoshone on her mother's side," Dorcas said, "which was not a thing you announced in this county in 1930, so we did not announce it. And she said there was a road through this basin, not a road for people. She said her grandmother's people knew where it was and didn't camp on it. She said it had a season like the deer have a season." "Did she say what used it?" Dorcas turned her cup a quarter turn on the table. "She said it wasn't a what. She said asking what used it was like asking what uses a river." I want to be careful here because I am a white woman repeating a fragment of somebody's family memory at 2 removes, 60 years after the fact, and if I dress it up into a legend, I will have done something dishonest. So I will say only what she said. She said there was a road, that her grandmother's people knew where it was, that they did not camp on it, that it had a season, and that the question, what was the wrong question? Then she said the thing that made the back of my neck go cold. "You've got 2 dead deer," she said. "In the open. Fat ones. Not chewed on." I had not told her about the deer. "Who told you that?" "Nobody told me. That's what it leaves." She looked at me with something that was not quite pity. "The ones that get caught in it don't get killed, Della. They get stopped. You find them lying down like they laid down. It's the ones that stay standing you want to worry about." "What do you mean, the ones that stay standing?" But she had said as much as she was going to say that day. She got up and put the cookies in a tin and asked me if I wanted to see what the pack rats had done to her tack room. And I understood that I was being dismissed, and I went and looked at the tack room and said something about steel wool, and I drove home in the dark. 2 miles from the ranch gate, I stopped the truck in the middle of the road and sat with the engine running and my hands on the wheel. I did not believe her. I want that recorded honestly, because it is the failure that everything after this depends on. I did not believe her. I thought I was listening to 80 years of ranch folklore built on top of a real phenomenon. Bad water, maybe, or a gas seep, or infrasound off the blacks in certain wind conditions, something with a physical mechanism that had been dressed in story the way people dress everything in story. I thought I was the person in this situation with the training. On October 19th, I called the USGS office in Carson City and asked whether Elias Kohut was still with them. He had retired in 1991. The woman I spoke to was helpful in the way that people are when a request is odd but harmless, and after 2 more calls and a week, I had a phone number in Grand Junction, Colorado. He answered on the 4th ring. He was 84 years old and his voice was thin, but there was nothing wrong with his mind. I told him who I was and where I was calling from, and I said the words, "Pale Horse Basin," and he did not say anything for so long that I thought the line had dropped. "You found the letter," he said. I found the letter. They said it wasn't in the file. It's in the 1981 plan correspondence filed under General. I think somebody pulled the decision file and missed a copy. Elias Kohut laughed. It was not a happy sound. 30 years, he said. All right, what do you want to know? What I wanted to know took 2 hours across 3 phone calls over 4 days, and I took 11 pages of notes, and here is the substance of it. In 1972, the Bureau had 4 monitoring wells drilled in the basin, 2 at the north end and 2 at the south, into the same alluvial aquifer. Kohut was assigned to the data. The wells were instrumented with float recorders producing continuous strip charts. For the first 4 years, nothing. Ordinary hydrographs, slow seasonal decline, spring recharge, the usual. In October of 1976, all 4 wells recorded a pressure event. Water levels rose, then dropped, then recovered, in a wave. Not simultaneously, sequentially. North wells first, south wells after, with a lag of about 4 days between the northernmost and the southernmost, which are 22 miles apart. That's 5.5 miles a day, I said. That is 5.5 miles a day, he agreed. In an aquifer where a pressure signal from pumping propagates at a rate you'd measure in hundreds of feet an hour, in the fast direction. There is no hydraulic mechanism that produces that. What produces it? A mass, he said. A mass moving through the medium, displacement. I ran it every other way for 2 years, Ms. Marchetti. Barometric loading, earth tides, seismic, thermal, a bad float in one instrument. You can rule a bad float out when 4 instruments 22 miles apart do the same thing in sequence. What that signal looks like is what you'd get if something the size of a building moved through the saturated zone from the north end of that basin to the south end at walking speed. I remember, I said. How deep? That's the question I got moved off the project for asking, he said. The screen intervals were between 130 and 200 feet. So somewhere in the upper 200 feet of unconsolidated material. That is not deep. There are wells in that county deeper than that. He had asked for two things. He had asked for a seismic array. Even 3 geophones, he said, would have settled it in one event. And he had asked for the wells to be re-instrumented with equipment capable of finer time resolution. He got neither. He was reassigned to a project in the Humboldt drainage in 1980, and the wells were plugged that same year, and he wrote the letter in 1979 as a way of putting his objection somewhere it could not be denied later, and it disappeared, and he spent the next decade being careful, and then he retired. "Did you ever go out there?" I asked him. "In person? During an event?" "Once," he said. "In October of 1978. I drove out because the North Wells had gone active on the chart the week before, and I wanted to be there when the pulse reached the south end. I got to the basin on the 12th or 13th, and I want to tell you something, and I want to tell you I have never known what to make of it." "All right." "There was nothing alive in that basin," he said. "I don't mean it was quiet. I mean I stood on the road with a clipboard for 3 hours and I did not see a bird, an insect, a lizard, a rabbit, or a track that had been made that day. And the second thing is that I got a headache like nothing I've ever had, behind my eyes, and I had a nosebleed that would not stop for about 20 minutes. And I attributed all of it at the time to the altitude and the dry air, and I drove out. And I did not go back." I asked him the question I had been building to for 2 hours. "Dr. Kohut, if you had to say what it is." "I have had 30 years to think about that, and I have never once had a sentence I was willing to finish," he said. "So I will tell you what I have instead, which is a comparison, and you can throw it away. There is a thing that happens in the Antarctic ice sheets. There are lakes under 2 miles of ice, and they fill, and when they fill they drain, and the water moves under the ice from one basin to another. And it happens on a schedule of years or decades, and if you were standing on the surface, you would never know. There is a whole hydrology up there that has nothing to do with the world we walk around in. It has its own seasons. It's been running that way for a long time, and it will keep running after we stop looking. Now, I do not think there is a lake under Pale Horse Basin, but I think there is a system under it that has a season, and I think it has been running for a very long time. And I think the reason we don't know about it is not that it's hidden. It's that it's slow, and it's under us, and we've been paying attention for about 140 years. I said, "The animals know about it." "Of course the animals know about it," said Elias Kohut. "The animals have been paying attention for 2 million years." On October 24th, I asked my field manager about Category 3. I want to describe this carefully because I have thought about it more than almost anything else in this account, and because the answer I got is the reason I understand what kind of thing was actually going on. The field manager was a man named Gil Deshotel. He was 44, an MPA out of Arizona State, ambitious in the way that people are when the field office is a stepping stone to a state office job, and I did not dislike him. He was competent and a little frightened of the ranchers, and he approved my travel without arguing. I went into his office with the 1998 overlay map, and I put it on his desk, and I put my finger on the gray strip, and I said, "Gil, what is this?" He looked at it for a second and said, "Category 3, it's a legacy allocation. There's no Appendix K." "There's no what?" "The legend refers to Appendix K. The plan doesn't have an Appendix K." He turned the map around and read the legend box, and I watched him read it twice, and then he said, and I am confident he was being entirely honest, "Huh, well, that's a typo then. Probably an appendix that got dropped in the revision. What do you need it for?" And I said, "I've got some unusual wildlife mortality out there, and I want to know if there's something in that ground." Gil Deshotel leaned back in his chair and said the most illuminating thing anyone said to me that entire autumn. "Della, there is nothing in that ground. That is a nothing strip. I've been here 6 years, and I've never had a single action in it. And I'll tell you why. Because it's in the plan. And things that are in the plan don't generate work. If somebody applied for something in there, I'd deny it. And I'd deny it in about 4 minutes, because the plan says deny it. That's what the plan is for. It's a machine for not having to think. He was not covering anything up. He did not know anything to cover up. He had inherited a line on a map, and the line did what lines do, which is that it made a certain kind of question impossible to ask. And the reason nobody had asked it in 38 years was not that they had been silenced, but that the map had already answered it. Somebody in 1971 knew something, and instead of writing it down, which would have required saying it out loud, they did the thing that bureaucracies are actually superb at. They made it administratively impossible for anyone to go there, and then they retired, and the fact traveled forward for 4 decades disguised as a procedure. It nearly worked forever. What broke it was money. On October 27th, in the Elko paper, on page 6, there was a short article about a proposed solar generation facility. A company out of Nevada and Delaware with a name like a law firm had filed a right-of-way application with the Bureau for a photovoltaic project, 800 megawatts, on public land in Elko County. And the article said the application covered approximately 11,000 acres and had been accepted for processing in September. I drove to the office at 9 at night and let myself in and pulled up the case file in LR 2000, which is the Bureau's realty database, and I found the serial number, and I mapped the legal description township by hand, because the GIS layer had not been built yet. Sections 4 through 9 and 16 through 21 of T39N R58E, and a piece of the next township north. The north end of Pale Horse Basin, straddling the strip. About 14,000 acres of the proposed project area lay inside Category 3. The application had been accepted for processing on September 8, 2009. The pronghorn ran on the morning of September 9th. I sat in that dark office in front of a computer screen, and I felt something I can only describe as the floor of the world moving under me, because I had been building a theory in which the animals had detected something, a physical signal, a pressure wave, a sound below hearing, and every part of that theory was a machine that ran on cause and effect in a direction I understood. And now I had a fact that did not fit anywhere in it. 11 miles of empty desert and a herd of antelope, and a filing date in a database in Reno. I told myself it was coincidence. I told myself that for 6 weeks. I am telling you now that I did not believe it even at the time, and that the not believing sat in me like a swallowed stone. Here is where I have to describe the sequence of events in November, and here is where people stop being able to follow me, so I'm going to go slowly and give you dates. November 2nd, I found the 3rd deer. Adult doe, north end of the basin, same presentation, no wound, no scavenging, resting posture, good condition. I did not report it. I photographed it and I logged the coordinates in my personal notebook and not in the field log, and if you want to date the beginning of my professional misconduct, date it there. I also found, 60 yards from the deer, in a patch of fine silt in a dry wash, a boot print. It was a Vibram lug sole, size 11 or 12, deep enough that whoever made it was carrying weight. It was less than a day old, because we had had wind on the first that would have softened it. I followed it for about 400 yards and lost it on hardpan, and I found it again a quarter mile on, and it went north-northwest, into the strip, and it was not alone. There were 2 sets. Nobody walks into the middle of Pale Horse Basin in November. There is nothing there. There is no hunting, there is no water, there is no route to anywhere. I photographed the prints with a scale. I still have those photographs. November 4th. I drove the north end looking for a vehicle and found one. A white Ford Expedition, no markings, parked on the 2-track 2 miles inside the Category 3 boundary. There was nobody in it. I ran the plate through dispatch in Elko, and dispatch came back and said the plate returned to a leasing company in Sparks and asked if I needed a welfare check, and I said no. I put a card under the wiper with my name and number, and please contact BLM Pale Horse Reactivity and Restricted Allocation. Nobody called. November 6th. The expedition was gone. In the place where it had been parked, there were 4 steel stakes with orange flagging. set in a square about 30 feet on a side, and in the center of the square the ground had been disturbed. A hole about 8 inches across, refilled and tamped, with a small amount of drill cuttings scattered nearby. Fine gray material, not local surface material. Somebody had put a hole in the ground in the middle of the strip. I bagged a sample of the cuttings, which I still have, and which I never had tested, and which sat in my garage in Winnemucca for 16 years, in a paper sack labeled PHB 110609 in my handwriting. November 7th. I called the realty specialist in the state office in Reno, a woman I had worked with on a fiber line in 2004, and asked her, casually, as a favor, to tell me who was doing geotechnical work on the solar application. She called me back that afternoon and said the applicant's consultants had done a geotech program in late October and early November, 12 boreholes, standard for a project like that, and that she could email me the notice. Then she said, "Della, can I ask you something off the record?" "Sure." "That application, did somebody at your office flag a conflict on it?" "Not that I know of." "Why?" "Because the case has been reassigned twice in 8 weeks and it's got a hold on it now from somebody at Interior I've never heard of. And I've been doing this for 19 years and I have never seen a hold come down from that level on a solar row in Elko County." November 9th. Hollis called me on the radio at 6:40 in the morning, which was not our hour, and said, "Della, get in your truck." I asked him what. "The horses are gone," he said. "All of them. And I mean gone. I've been up on the saddle since first light and there is not a horse north of the Blacks, and there's something else and I want you to hear it from me before you see it. I'm looking at 3, maybe 400 head of antelope standing on Weems's south fence line. Standing, Della, not moving, all facing the same way." "Facing where?" "North," said Hollis. I made it to the south end of the basin at 8:15. He was right. I estimated between 350 and 400 pronghorn, which is more animals than that entire district was supposed to hold, packed into a strip along the fence about a half-mile long. Antelope do not bunch like that. They are not herd-dense animals. They hold spacing. They were shoulder to shoulder in places. They were facing north. They were absolutely still. And on the far side of them, mixed in with them and not being troubled by them, were mule deer, 40 or 50. And on the periphery, coyotes. I counted 9 coyotes standing within 100 yards of 400 antelope, and none of them were hunting, and none of the antelope were reacting. I have thought about that image every day of my life since. I got the spotting scope out of the truck and set it on the hood, and I looked at those animals for 20 minutes, and I could not find a single one that was grazing. Hollis came down off the ridge in his old Bronco and parked next to me, and we stood there together. "How long have they been like that?" I said. "Since first light, at least." "They'll break. They can't hold that." "They've been holding it 4 hours." I said, "It's coming south, isn't it?" And Hollis Pine, who had never in his life told me a thing he was not sure of, said, "Something's coming south." What we did over the next 4 days was reasonable, and it was useless, and I wanted in the record anyway, because when the investigation happened afterward, the finding was that I had acted outside the scope of assigned duties without notification, and that is true, and it is also not the whole of it. November 10th. I called Gil Deshotel at home on a Tuesday night and told him that there was unauthorized surface disturbance inside the Category 3 allocation, that I had photographs of a drill hole and stakes, and that I wanted a stop work order issued against the applicant's consultants. He was good about it, actually. He said, "Get me the coordinates and the photos, and I'll call Reno in the morning." He called me back at 11 the next day and said the geotech program had been authorized under a categorical exclusion, signed at the state office, and that he had been told, in a tone he did not appreciate, that the Pale Horse Field Office was not the decision-maker on this one. "I'm going to write it up anyway," he said, and I believe he did, and it is not his fault that nothing came of it. November 11th. I called Priya Ganguly at the State Wildlife Office and told her about the aggregation on the Weems fence line. She was genuinely excited. She had never heard of pronghorn bunching at that density outside of a fenced elk feed ground situation, and she said she would come out on the 16th with a graduate student to document it. The 16th was 2 days too late. I have not stopped thinking about the fact that if she had come on the 13th, I would have had a witness with credentials, and possibly a second body in the basin, and I do not know which of those thoughts is worse. November 12th. I drove to Elko and used a computer at the library, because by then I had a feeling about my office machine that I would not have been able to defend, and I did two things. The first was that I looked for other Category 3 allocations. There is a national database of land use plan allocations, or at least there was a rudimentary one, and I searched the field office plans I could get at electronically for that specific phrase. I found three more, one in the Owyhee Uplands in southeastern Oregon, a strip about 20 miles long, established 1968. One in the Escalante Desert in Utah, established 1974. One in the Big Smoky Valley south of us, established 1971, the same year as ours. All four were long, narrow, straight, and oriented roughly northwest to southeast. The Big Smoky one and ours, if you extended them on a map, were not on the same line, but they were parallel to within a few degrees. I sat in that library and drew the extensions on a Nevada highway map with a ballpoint pen, and I understood that I was doing something that a person in a documentary about a paranoid man does, and I did it anyway, because the lines were parallel and I had not made them parallel. The second thing I did was look up the death of a survey crew. Dorcas had said a thing to me at the very end of my visit, at the door, in the voice people use when they have decided to give you one more thing and no more. She said, "Ask about the boys from the mapping outfit in '68. The Elko paper had it in the archive on microfilm. October 1968. 3 men on a contract survey crew, working out of Del Springs, doing section corner recovery in the basin for a mapping contract. Their vehicle was found on the 22nd. The men were not. 2 of them were never found. That is a matter of public record, and you can check it. The third was found 11 days later, 26 miles southeast, walking on the shoulder of the state highway near Curry. He was 31 years old, and his name was Merle Sackett, and he was in reasonably good physical condition considering, and he was, in the language of the newspaper article, unable to assist investigators. There was a follow-up article in January of 1969. Merle Sackett had been evaluated at the state hospital in Sparks. He was oriented to person, but not to time or place. He was not injured. There was no evidence of head trauma, no evidence of intoxication, no fever. He could answer questions about his childhood. He could not form new memories at all. Everything after the 22nd of October slid off him. The article said that his family had taken him home to Idaho. It said that his sister had told the reporter that when the wind came up outside the house, Merle would stand up and face into it. November 13th. In the afternoon, a man came to my office. I have never known who he actually was. He introduced himself as Warren Tice and said he was with the Department of the Interior, Office of the Solicitor, and he had a card that said so, and a federal ID that I looked at for maybe 2 seconds because I was not expecting to need to remember it. He was about 60, soft-spoken, gray suit and hiking boots, which is a combination you see in that agency, and which normally means somebody who came up through the field. He asked if we could talk in my office, and I said we could. He said he understood I had raised a concern about surface disturbance and a legacy allocation. I said I had. He asked if I would tell him what I had observed. I did. The deer, the aggregation, the drill hole, and I did not mention Kohut or Dorcas, and I do not know to this day why I held those back except that I did. He listened the way Hollis listened, which is to say completely. Then he said, "Ms. Marchetti, I'm going to tell you 2 things. The first is that the geotechnical program in that area is being terminated, as of this morning. The applicant is going to be told that the northern portion of their project area is unavailable, and that they can either redesign or withdraw." I said that was good news. "The second thing," he said, "is that I'd like you to stay out of the basin for the next 10 days. I asked him why, and he said, and I remember the exact phrasing because it was the phrasing of a man who had spent a long career learning how to say things that were true and useless at the same time. Because the allocation exists for a reason, and the reason is seasonal, and this is the season. I said, what is it? I don't know, said Warren Tice. That's not an answer. It's the only true one I have. I've had this file for 9 years. There is no document anywhere in the department that says what it is. There is a decision from 1971 that says the land is unsuitable, and there is an oral tradition inside a very small number of positions that says the decision was correct and that you leave it alone. And I inherited that from a man who inherited it from a man. And every one of us has spent our careers making sure that nothing is built there and nobody is standing there in October or November. And we have not been curious, and I want to be clear with you that the lack of curiosity is deliberate, and it is the only part of this that I am proud of. I said, people died out there in 1968. Yes. And nobody wrote it down. Somebody wrote it down in 1971, he said, and what they wrote down was a boundary. Ms. Marchetti, I'm not going to sit here and tell you that's adequate. I'm telling you it's what there is. Stay out of the basin for 10 days, please. He left. I never saw him again, and 11 years later I tried to find him and could not, and the office of the solicitor had no record of an attorney by that name, which either means something or means that I misheard a name over 16 years of remembering it. He was right about the geotechnical program. It stopped. The applicant redesigned the project south and west by 9 miles, and it was eventually built. And it is generating power today, and if you drive that highway you can see it. And the northern 14,000 acres they wanted are still empty. I did not stay out of the basin. November 14th, 2009. Hollis called me at 4:52 in the morning. I know the time because the call woke me and I looked at the clock radio. They're moving, he said. The antelope? Everything. His voice was strange. Not frightened fast, the way a person sounds when they are describing something while it happens. I'm on the saddle above the Weems place. Della, the whole aggregation is going southeast, all of it, and it's not a run, it's a walk. They're walking. 400 antelope walking southeast at first light in a body, and the deer are with them, and there are coyotes in the middle of them. I was pulling my boots on with the phone against my shoulder. How far? They're already past the fence. They'll be over the Curry Divide by 9. Hollis, don't go into the basin. I'm on the saddle. I'm above it. I'm fine. Get up here. I want to record what I did next in the correct order, because at the deposition I was asked about it repeatedly. I put on field clothes. I filled 2 water bottles. I took the office Nikon, my binoculars, my personal notebook, a handheld GPS, and my radio. I did not take the bureau truck. I took my own truck, a 1994 Toyota, and I have thought about why for a long time, and the answer is that I already knew I was doing something I did not want to be doing officially, and that when a person makes a choice like that, they are usually further along than they think. I did not call Gildeesh Hotel. I did not call dispatch. I did not tell anyone where I was going. I left Del Springs at 5:30. It is 41 miles of dirt to the south end of the basin, and I made it in a little over an hour. The first thing I noticed, coming down the last grade with the sun not up yet, was that my ears felt wrong. Not blocked, not popping, full. The sensation you get in an elevator in a tall building, or at the bottom of a swimming pool, except that it did not resolve when I swallowed, and it did not resolve when I opened my jaw, and it stayed at exactly the same intensity for the next 4 hours, and I noticed it and filed it and kept driving, because I had a friend on a ridge and animals moving, and I was thinking about none of the right things. The second thing I noticed was the silence. I have described the sound floor. I want to try to describe its absence one more time and better. I stopped the truck at the mouth of the basin at 6:40 and got out to open a gate, and when I shut the truck door, the sound of the door shutting did not go anywhere. There was no echo, which was normal. There is nothing out there to echo off. But there was also no carry. The sound went about 10 feet and stopped, as though the air had stopped conducting past a certain radius. And under it, behind it, in it, There was nothing at all. No wind, no insects, no birds, not one raven. And there are always ravens. There are ravens at the end of the world. I stood by that gate with my hand on the cold steel, and every animal instinct I have was telling me to get in the truck and drive south. And I overrode it. Because I was 51 years old and educated, and it was 2009 and I had a camera. That is the whole failure right there. That is the thing I have spent 16 years turning over. The animals had a system for this that was 2 million years old and correct, and I had a system for it that was about 400 years old, and that told me to gather data. I met Hollis on the saddle at 7:20. He was out of the Bronco with his binoculars up and his notebook open on the hood, and he was writing while he watched, which was how he did everything. He had on his canvas coat and a wool cap, and he was smiling at me, and I wanted to be able to hold on to that. "Look at it," he said. I looked at it. Below us, moving southeast across the last 4 miles of Pale Horse Basin in the early light, was every large animal for 30 miles. I could not count them. The estimate I gave the investigation was 600 pronghorn, 80 to 100 mule deer, at least 20 coyotes, and, this is the part they cut from the report, 3 mountain lions walking in the open, within sight of each other and of the herd in daylight. They were not running. They were walking, in a broad front about a mile wide, at maybe 4 miles an hour southeast, and there was no dust because the ground was damp from a rain on the 11th and there was no sound. 600 animals moving on hardpan, and I could not hear them from a mile away. "How long have your head hurt?" Hollis said. "Since I came down the grade." "Mine too. Started about 6. He lowered the glasses. "Della, my compass is turning." He handed it to me. It was a good Silva baseplate compass, and the needle was rotating slowly and steadily, clockwise, taking about 40 seconds to make a full revolution. I have been asked about this many times. I do not have an explanation. I know what a compass does near a truck, near a magnet, near iron-rich rock. I know what a slow, steady rotation is not. We watched the front of the animals reach the southeast rim and go over it and start down the far side and keep going. And then I made the decision that I have to live with. I said, I want to see the north end. Hollis looked at me for a long moment. "They're all going south," he said. "That's why. Whatever's behind them, it's still north of here, and it's coming this way at 5 miles a day. If I get up on the blacks at the sawmill gap, I'm 400 feet above the floor and I can see 15 miles of basin. I can photograph it. Hollis, we can see it. Or we can go southeast with the antelope," said Hollis Pine. I said, "I've got a job." He closed his notebook and put it in his coat pocket, and he said the last complete sentence he ever said to me, which was, "All right, but we take 1 truck and I'm driving, because your Toyota won't get up that gap." We got in the Bronco. We drove north up the Basin Road at about 20 miles an hour for 11 miles, into it, against the direction of every living thing in that country. At the 8-mile mark, my nose started bleeding. At 9, his did. We laughed about it. I want that in the record too. We laughed, and he handed me a shop rag off the floor of the Bronco, and I remember him saying something about the altitude, which was a joke because there is no altitude. At 8:55 in the morning, we reached the base of the sawmill gap and got out. The pressure in my ears had become something I would describe as weight, not pain. So I walked. I walked south down the Pale Horse Basin Road at about 9:50 in the morning on November 14th, 2009, and behind me I could hear the starter turning, and I did not turn around because I was afraid that if I turned around I would go back. It caught. I heard the engine catch, I heard it settle into an idle, and I stopped and I turned around, and the Bronco was 50 yards behind me with the hood still up, and Hollis was standing at the front bumper with both hands on the fender facing north. I called his name. He did not turn. He was standing, facing north, the way Merle Sackett's sister said Merle would stand up and face into the wind, and I have known since that morning that I had about 10 seconds in which I could have run back and taken hold of him and pulled, and I have never been able to decide whether I did not do it because I was frightened, or because some part of me understood that it would not have made any difference, and the truth is probably that I was frightened. I did not go back. I turned around and I ran south. I ran for what the GPS later told me was 2¾ miles, and then I walked, and then I ran again, and the last thing I am able to report from any position of reliability is that at some point in the first mile, the pressure went out of my ears all at once, like a door closing somewhere behind me, and the sound came back, the whole floor of it, wind and brush and my own breathing and, God help me, a raven. And I sat down in the road and I could not get up for a while. I got to the Weems place a little before 2 in the afternoon. Dorcas Weems, 81 years old, saw me come up her drive on foot and did not ask me a single question. She sat me at the table and put a cup of coffee in front of me and she said, "Was it Hollis or was it you?" I said, "Hollis." And she said, "Then he's gone, honey." And she put her hand on the back of my neck and held it there. And that is the last unambiguous kindness in this account. Search and rescue went in on the morning of November 15th, which was 18 hours later, because that is how long it took me to convince the Elko County Sheriff's Office that a 63-year-old man in a running vehicle on a county road was a missing person and not a man who had gone to town. I did not go in with them. I asked to, and I was told no, and by then Gil Deshotel had arrived and had taken one look at me and put me in the passenger seat of his Suburban. They found the Bronco at 10:40 in the morning at the base of the Sawmill Gap, exactly where it had been, with the hood down and the keys in the ignition and about a quarter tank of gas. It started on the first turn. Hollis's coat was folded on the driver's seat. His notebook was in the coat pocket. His glasses were on the dash. They ran dogs. The dogs would not work. I was not there for that, but I have read the report, and the report says, in the flat language those reports use, that both K9 teams were unable to establish or follow a track, and that the handlers noted unusual reluctance. One of the dogs, a Belgian Malinois with 6 years of experience, would not get out of the vehicle. They searched for 9 days with about 60 people in 2 aircraft. They found nothing. Not a boot print, not a scrap, not a body. There were 60 searchers on that basin floor for 9 days in late November, and not one of them reported feeling anything at all. And I believe them, because by the 15th it was past. The sage on the flat below the gap was pale and canted southeast in a band 200 yards wide, and everybody who walked through it, and one of the searchers made a remark about grazing pressure, and it went in nobody's report but mine. They found the deer, though. 11 of them, along both edges of that band, plus 2 coyotes and 1 adult mountain lion, an animal that had been in perfect health. No wounds, no scavenging, resting posture. The state took 4 heads. 3 came back with elevated cortisol, and 1 came back with bilateral middle ear hemorrhage, and a wildlife health specialist in Reno wrote a note about the possibility of a localized lightning event, and that is the official explanation to this day. And lightning does not occur in that basin in November, and does not kill 14 animals in a 200-yard wide strip 31 miles long over the course of 40 years. The investigation into my conduct took 4 months. The findings were that I had entered the field on a non-duty day in a personal vehicle without notifying dispatch, that I had failed to report a wildlife mortality on November 2nd, that I had removed a physical sample from public land without a permit, and that my account of the events of November 14th was not corroborated by physical evidence. I was given a letter of reprimand and reassigned at the same grade to the Winnemucca district, 60 miles from where I was born. Nobody ever accused me of hurting Hollis Pine. I want to say that because when I tell people about the deposition, they always assume that is what it was about. It was not. The sheriff's office cleared me in a week. There was no evidence of anything, and there was nothing in 20 years of 2 people's lives to suggest a motive, and everyone who knew us knew. What the deposition was about was liability. The applicant had a right-of-way application that had been killed, and they wanted to know why. And they had heard that a bureau employee had been out there making claims, and their lawyers spent 2 days trying to establish that I was the source of an unfounded environmental allegation that had cost their client 11 months and several $1 million. I sat in a conference room in Reno in March of 2010, and I answered their questions as narrowly as I could, and when they asked me directly what I believed had happened to Mr. Pine, I said that I did not know. Which was true. It is still true. Warren Tice did not appear at the deposition, but the hold on the application, which had come from a level nobody could name, was never lifted for the northern parcels, and the company redesigned, and no lawyer ever asked me another question. I need to account for the following years quickly, because they are mostly the ordinary sadness of a person who has had something happen to her. I stayed with the Bureau until 2016 and retired at 58, 3 years earlier than I had planned, with a smaller pension than I would have had. I was competent and quiet in Winnemucca, and I did not talk about Pale Horse. Twice, at trainings, somebody who had heard something asked me about it, and both times I said that a friend of mine had died in a search and rescue situation, and that I would rather not, and both times they were decent about it. Hollis was declared dead in 2016 on a court order. He had a daughter in Boise who I had never met, and who was kind to me on the phone and who did not want the notebooks, so I have them. 41 field notebooks, 1979 to 2009, in a footlocker in my hall closet. The last entry is 9:22 a.m., November 14th, 2009. It is in his handwriting, and it is perfectly legible, and it says, Sage and band below, gap-oriented SSE approx 15 to green. Band approx 200 YD wide, continuous N and S as far as visible. Mortality along both margins, not within band. Not a kill. Margin effect. Whatever moves in the band, the ones on the edge get the shoulder of it, and then below that, in the same steady hand. This is the fourth one in my lifetime, and I have written it down 4 times. Dorcas Weems died in 2013 at 85 in the house, which is what she wanted. I drove out and sat with her twice in her last year. The second time she told me one more thing, and I have never been able to decide what to do with it, so I am putting it here without comment. She said that in October of 1961, when she was 33, she and her father had gone out at dawn to move cattle, and the cattle were already gone through the fence. And on the way back, they had passed a place on the flat where the brush was pale, and there had been a man standing in it. She said he was maybe 200 yards off, standing in the middle of the pale band, facing north, and that her father had stopped the truck and had not gotten out. She said she asked her father if they should go and see about him, and her father said no. She said they drove home and it was never spoken of again, and she did not know, then or later, whether the man was somebody from town or a stranger or anything at all. She said, he wasn't moving, but he wasn't standing still either. He was going somewhere. He just wasn't going anywhere we could see. Elias Kohut died in 2012 in Grand Junction. I know because I called the number in 2013 and his daughter answered. She said he had left a box for me. He had never met me and had spoken to me on the telephone 3 times in 2009, and he had put my name on a box. It was strip chart records. Photocopies. He had never had the originals. He had made copies in 1979 knowing what was going to happen to the files. Of the 4 Pale Horse monitoring wells, 1972 to 1980, with the events circled in red pencil and dated in the margins in his handwriting. There are 5 events in 8 years of record. October 1976, November 1977, October 1978. There is a gap of a year. Then November 1980, 2 months before the wells were plugged, and one in September 1974 that he had circled twice and annotated anomalous, N to S as usual, but returns 3 weeks later, S to N, slower. Only bidirectional event in record. Note, 1974 is the only year of record with heavy sept precip. I do not know what that means. I have spent years not knowing what it means. But I think about the phrase it has a season, and I think about the fact that things with seasons go somewhere and then come back. And I think about the way that every animal in that basin runs southeast, always southeast, out the low end. And I wonder what the ones on the southeast side do, in the years when it comes back. I live in Winnemucca now, in my mother's house, which I inherited. I am 68. My sister is 2 hours away and calls on Sundays. Here is why I am finally putting this on paper. Two things happened this spring. The first is that in March, a man was found walking on the shoulder of US 93 north of Wells, Nevada, disoriented, uninjured, unable to say his name. He was in his 40s. The story ran for 3 days, and then he was identified as a man who had walked away from a care facility in Utah with a documented history, and it was nothing. And I read every version of that story 4 times, and I called the sheriff's office in Elko like a crazy woman, and it was nothing. But I sat in my kitchen with the phone in my hand afterward, and I understood something about myself, which is that I have been waiting for 16 years for a man to be found walking on a highway, and that I am going to keep waiting, and that this is not a healthy way for a person to spend the end of her life. Writing it down is the only thing I have not tried. The second thing is worse. In February, a project was announced in the Big Smoky Valley, 300 miles south of Pale Horse. Not solar this time. A transmission line, a big one, 500 kilovolt, part of a regional interconnection, running north-northwest to south-southeast down the length of that valley. I looked up the route. I looked up the 1971 Category 3 allocation in that field office's plan, which is still there, because those allocations are still there, all 4 of them, sitting in the plans like fossils. The line crosses it at an oblique angle for about 9 miles. I wrote a letter during the public comment period. I identified myself as a retired bureau employee with 28 years of service, and I confined myself to what could be documented: the existence of the allocation, the 1971 classification, the absence of Appendix K, the 1979 Cohoot letter, which I attached, and the 1968 survey crew, and I asked that the alignment be shifted east. I got a form response thanking me for my comment and stating that the identified allocation had been reviewed and that no conflict was identified because the allocation restricted authorized surface use, and the transmission line would be an authorized use subject to a plan amendment, which was being processed. A plan amendment. 38 years of a line on a map that worked because nobody looked at it, and the way it ends is not a conspiracy and not a betrayal. The way it ends is that somebody amends the plan because the reason for the line was never written down, and a reason that was never written down cannot survive contact with a process. Warren Tice's generation kept it by not being curious. Mine broke it by being curious. The next one will break it by being efficient. I have one more thing to tell you, and then I am finished. In October of last year, I drove back. I want to be honest that I had been planning it for 2 years, and that I told my sister I was going to Elko for a funeral. I did not go into the basin. I want that clear. I went to the saddle above the Weems place, which is high ground on the southeast rim, outside the strip, and I parked, and I sat on the hood of my truck with Hollis's binoculars, which I still use, and I looked north up 31 miles of empty Nevada in the early light. The Weems place is gone, by the way. The house burned in 2019 after Dorcas's estate sold it, and nobody rebuilt. There is a haul road at the north end now that was not there in 2009, serving a mineral exploration lease outside the strip, and there was a light on it at that hour, some outfit's pickup with its headlights on, 11 miles away. I sat there for about an hour and I did not feel anything. No pressure, no weight, no attention. It was a cold, ordinary, beautiful basin full of nothing, and there were ravens. And then, at about 6:45, on the flat below me, 30 or 40 pronghorn that had been grazing in the rabbit brush since before I got there, stopped eating. All of them, at the same instant. Not a ripple, not a spread. Heads up, bodies turned, all facing north-northwest. I did not wait to see what they did. I got in my truck and I drove southeast out of Pale Horse Basin at 50 miles an hour on a road rated for 25. And I did not stop until I was on pavement, and I want to tell you that I felt foolish afterward. And I did, for about 10 minutes. And then I felt something I have not felt since I was 51 years old, which is that I had gotten a thing right. Because that is the whole of what I know. That is the entire content of 16 years and 11 pages of notes and 4 field notebooks and a sack of drill cuttings in the garage. I do not know what moves down that basin. I do not know if it is alive, if alive is even a category that applies. I do not know if it is one thing that returns or a condition the ground enters. I do not know where it goes at the southeast end, and I have never had the courage to find out whether the strip continues under the Curry Divide, though I could get that from a map in an afternoon, and I have not, and I know exactly what that says about me. I do not know if it means us harm. I think, if I am honest, that it does not, that it has no opinion of us at all, that it is not a predator and not a hunter, that it is a large, slow fact moving through the world on a schedule that was set before there was anyone to consult, and that the deer along the margins and the survey crew in 1968 and Hollis at the base of the Sawmill Gap were not taken. They were in the way. But I know the one thing, and I have earned it, and it is the only thing I have to give anybody. The animals in that country have a warning system that is older than our species, and it is not for us, and it does not care whether we believe it, and it has never once been wrong. It does not require you to understand it. It does not require you to have a theory. It requires exactly one thing of you, and Hollis Pine knew it for 30 years and said it out loud one time, 4 minutes before it stopped mattering for him. And it took me until I was 67 years old and sitting on the hood of a truck on a cold morning to finally do it without arguing. When the animals run, you run too. You do not stop to take a photograph. You do not go up on the ridge to get a better angle. You do not tell yourself that you are the one out here with the training. You go the way they are going, and you go now, and you find out what it was afterward from a long way off, if you find out at all. That is the whole job. It was always the whole job. I am going to mail this to 3 people and put a copy in the footlocker with the notebooks, and then I am going to go sit on the porch, because it is October, and there are antelope on the flat east of this town, and I have gotten into the habit of watching them. They have been calm all week. I suppose it is expected that anybody who chooses to follow in the footsteps of Smokey the Bear would be possibly stuck in a few scary situations. That certainly was the case for me, as I spent my nights working alongside park rangers on some of most dangerous and terrifying trails in the States. It's not what one might think about being a ranger, though. We don't spend every day sitting around watching deer graze or children play in the playgrounds. Instead, what happens behind those locked gates is something more akin to horror movies than a picnic. If you manage to find your way through these wooded corridors without being eaten alive by some wild animal or eaten after a bear, you could end up with some serious psychological damage. As my first summer as a ranger was coming to an end, I decided that I wanted to spend one last night in the woods alone. Not many rangers do that kind of thing anymore, but for me, it was sort of this cleansing ritual. My girlfriend had just broken up with me at the time, and I needed time to work through that emotional trauma. I knew there were other people who understood my pain. They would be likely willing to talk about the world ending when we got close enough in proximity. Every man needs his space from time to time, even if he is working within the confines of the law. To be honest, I wasn't really sure what to expect to be out there in the woods with no one else around. I had been alone quite a few times before, but never running into any real trouble. But this time, my mind was racing through the worst-case scenarios, and it almost felt like fate that I would get caught up in some kind of adventure. The breakup with Sarah had been devastating. 3 years together, and she ended it with a text message while I was on duty. "We want different things," she wrote. The truth was that she wanted the stability of city life, and I couldn't give up the wilderness. The parks had become my sanctuary after my father died 2 years ago. He'd been a ranger for 30 years before cancer took him, and following in his footsteps felt like keeping part of him alive. My supervisor, Jenkins, had tried to talk me out of the solo overnight. "The trails at Oroville are getting strange reports lately," he'd said, his weathered face creased with concern. 3 hikers went missing last month. They turned up eventually, but they were different. Wouldn't talk about what happened. I dismissed his concerns with the confidence of youth. "I know every inch of that park, sir. I'll stick to the established areas." He'd sighed, running a hand through his gray hair. "At least take the radio." The radio now hung at my belt, silent as the trees around me. I'd sworn I would use it if anything unusual happened. But what constitutes unusual in a place where mountain lions scream like murdered women and bears can appear from nowhere like furry ghosts? As the afternoon waned, I packed my gear: standard issue sleeping bag, first aid kit, water purification tablets, emergency flares, a hunting knife my father had given me on my 16th birthday, and enough food for 24 hours. I'd left my itinerary with the station as required, marking my intended camping spot near the eastern shore of Lake Oroville. Jenkins' parting words echoed in my mind as I locked my truck at the ranger station. "The woods have been restless lately, Miller. Like they're hiding something." At the time, I'd laughed. Now, as shadows lengthened across the trail and the late August heat began to dissipate, his words carried an ominous weight I couldn't shake. The trail to Lake Oroville wound through ancient redwoods that blocked the fading sunlight, creating a premature dusk on the forest floor. Normally, I found comfort in the embrace of these giants, but today, the silence felt oppressive. No birdsong, no rustling of small animals in the underbrush, just the crunch of my boots on fallen pine needles and my own breathing. I reached the first junction and hesitated. The main trail continued straight, well-maintained and regularly patrolled. The smaller path to the right descended more steeply toward my favorite spot, a secluded inlet rarely visited by tourists. Standing at this crossroads, I felt a prickle along my spine, as though unseen eyes were watching from the deepening shadows. "Get a grip, Miller," I muttered to myself, adjusting my pack. "This is your home." I chose the right-hand path, moving deeper into territory I knew well, but suddenly felt foreign. The radio at my hip emitted a burst of static, making me jump. I unclipped it, bringing it to my ear, but heard only the empty hiss of dead air. "Ranger station, this is Miller. Radio check. Over." No response came through the static. I tried again with the same result. We knew there were dead zones in the park where the mountains blocked the signal, but this wasn't one of them. At least it hadn't been before. Unease crawled up my spine, but I pressed on. The lake would be visible soon, and with it would come the open sky and hopefully better reception. The trail narrowed, forcing me to duck under low-hanging branches that seemed to reach for my pack like grasping fingers. A sudden crack echoed through the forest, the unmistakable sound of a branch breaking under weight. I froze, scanning the dense undergrowth for movement. Nothing. Then, from somewhere ahead, came a sound that didn't belong in these woods. A low, rhythmic humming, almost like chanting, rising and falling on the still air. My first thought was illegal campers. We'd had problems with occult groups in the past, drawn to the ancient trees for their rituals, usually harmless but a fire hazard and disturbance to wildlife. I continued forward more cautiously, one hand on my knife, the other reaching for the flashlight as daylight continued to fade. The trail opened onto a small clearing, and beyond it the dark waters of Lake Oroville stretched into the distance, reflecting the first stars appearing in the twilight sky. My favorite spot lay just ahead, a natural peninsula that jutted into the water, creating a perfect campsite surrounded on three sides by the lake. The humming had stopped, replaced by the gentle lapping of water against the shore. Relief washed over me. Whatever I had heard was gone, and the familiar view of the lake restored my confidence. I would make camp, get some sleep, and in the morning everything would seem less ominous. Sarah and her rejection would be just another memory to leave behind in the city. I just crossed over one of the small bridges leading across the lake when I heard something rustling behind me, more similar to low growls than anything else, really. It sounded like something was stalking towards me, perhaps a bear. The only thing about these sounds that didn't scream bear were its frequency. They were more sporadic than I would have expected. My ears picked up this distinct sound of footsteps. More than once, actually, as if somebody were running towards me, directly through the thicket. Not wanting to meet with whatever was out there on my own terms, I scrambled for one of the trees and threw myself up into it to try and hide. Unfortunately, jumping back had cost me more time than I realized, and by the time that I reached around and grabbed hold of a branch, something hit me hard right in the side. The impact knocked the breath from my lungs and sent me sprawling across the forest floor. My pack cushioned some of the fall, but pain radiated through my ribs. I gasped, trying to pull air back into my body, my vision swimming with black spots. Through the disorientation, I heard those footsteps again. Multiple sets, circling me. I rolled onto my back, fumbling for my knife, but my fingers found only empty leather. The sheath had torn open in the fall, the blade lost somewhere in the darkness. "Who's there?" I called, my voice hoarse. "This is Ranger Miller. Identify yourself." Only silence answered me, broken by the soft snap of twigs as whatever circled me continued its approach. I activated my flashlight, sweeping the beam in a wide arc around me. The light caught a figure just beyond the trees, humanoid but wrong somehow. It ducked away before I could focus, but the glimpse I caught froze the blood in my veins. Gaunt, pale skin stretched over an elongated face, eyes reflecting the light like an animal's. I scrambled to my feet, ignoring the stabbing pain in my side. My radio. I needed to call for backup. I grabbed it from my belt, pressing the transmit button with trembling fingers. "Emergency. Ranger Miller at East Oralville. Coordinates." Something struck my hand, sending the radio flying into the underbrush. I spun, swinging the flashlight like a club, but hit only air. The footsteps had multiplied, coming from all directions now. My light caught flashes of movement, thin, agile forms darting between trees, always staying just at the edge of visibility. "I'm armed," I lied, backing toward the lake. Water at my back would limit their approach to one direction. "State Park law enforcement, stand down." A high, keening sound rose from the forest. Not quite human, not quite animal. It was answered by similar calls, a nightmarish chorus surrounding me. I counted at least 5 distinct voices communicating in some primal language I couldn't comprehend. The peninsula was 30 yards away. If I could reach it, set up a defensive position, maybe light one of the emergency flares. I took a deep breath and ran. The forest erupted into movement behind me. Branches whipped my face as I sprinted down the narrow trail, the beam of my flashlight bouncing wildly ahead. The footsteps gained on me, impossibly fast, accompanied by that terrible keening that seemed to come from everywhere at once. 20 yards. My lungs burned, each breath sending shards of pain through my injured ribs. 10 yards. The open area of the peninsula was visible now, the dark water beyond it my only hope of safety. 5 yards. Something snagged my ankle, sending me crashing to the ground. My flashlight flew from my grasp, spinning across the dirt to illuminate a grotesque scene. Pale, emaciated figures emerging from the tree line, moving with a terrible, fluid grace that no human could possess. I kicked frantically at whatever held my ankle, connecting with something solid. A shriek of pain echoed through the shaft, and the grip released. I scrambled higher, my hands finally reaching the edge of the opening above. With one final surge of strength, I pulled myself through the gap and into the cool night air of the forest. I lay there for a moment, gasping, the loamy soil against my face the sweetest sensation I had ever experienced. But there was no time to rest. Clawed hands were already reaching through the opening, grasping at air. I staggered to my feet, trying to orient myself. The forest was unfamiliar in the darkness, but the stars above provided some guidance. The North Star hung low on the horizon. I needed to head south to reach the ranger station. I began to run, crashing through underbrush, branches whipping at my face and arms. Behind me, inhuman cries rose from the earth as the creatures emerged from their underground domain. The hunt was on. I ran as I had never run before, ignoring the protests of my battered body. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves sent fresh waves of terror through me. They knew these woods far better than I did, even in darkness. The trees began to thin, and ahead I could see the gleam of moonlight on water, the lake. I had somehow circled back to Lake Oralville. New hope surged through me. I knew this area, could find my way from here. The ranger station was 5 miles south along the lake shore. A figure loomed suddenly from the darkness, blocking my path. One of the creatures, its black eyes reflecting starlight. I skidded to a halt, casting about desperately for a weapon. My hand closed around a fallen branch, and I swung it with all my remaining strength. The branch connected with a sickening crack, and the creature fell. I didn't wait to see if it would rise again, instead, plunging onward toward the lake. More shapes moved in the forest around me, converging on my position. The lakeshore was only yards away now. If I could reach the water, my foot caught on an exposed root, sending me sprawling. Pain exploded in my ankle, but adrenaline pushed it aside. I scrambled forward on hands and knees, then forced myself upright again. The lakeshore was before me, a narrow strip of pebbly beach leading to the dark water beyond. I splashed into the shallows just as the creatures reached the tree line. They halted there, hissing and clicking in what seemed like frustration. One stepped forward, the tall one, its necklace of teeth gleaming in the moonlight. "Remember," it called, its rasping voice carrying clearly across the water. "Remember and fear." I waded deeper, the cold water now at my waist. The creatures remained at the shoreline, watching with those terrible black eyes. They would not follow me into the water, I realized. Whether from inability or some taboo, I didn't know and didn't care. The lake offered safety. I swam until my arms felt like lead, then rolled onto my back to float, staring up at the star-filled sky. The full moon illuminated the lake like a spotlight, turning the water to liquid silver. In that moment of exhaustion and relief, a strange calm settled over me. I had survived. Whatever the Forgotten had done to me, whatever their purpose, I had escaped. When I felt strength returning to my limbs, I turned and swam for the southern shore, toward the ranger station. Each stroke was agony, my muscles protesting after the ordeal they had endured. But the pain was real, human pain, not the otherworldly burning of the creature's markings. My feet touched bottom eventually, and I dragged myself onto the shore, collapsing on the rocky beach. Dawn was breaking, the eastern sky lightening to pearl gray. I lay there watching the sun rise, feeling its warmth on my face like a benediction. I had almost convinced myself that the whole experience had been some vivid hallucination. Perhaps I'd eaten something toxic, or suffered a head injury in a fall, when I caught sight of my reflection in a still pool of water near the shore. Dark markings covered my face, swirling patterns that pulsed slightly with each heartbeat. The tall one's blood had left its mark, just as it had promised. I had no recollection of how I managed to reach the ranger station. Park visitors found me stumbling along the main trail, delirious and babbling about underground creatures. By the time the medical team arrived, I had lost consciousness. I had so much flooding through my mind, I feel like I kind of blacked out. I don't really know if I remember much after that, but I do distinctly remember collapsing on the ground and being found later on. I know that's probably very anticlimactic, but when the human body endures that kind of trauma, stress, it does things to the brain that aren't exactly normal. Anyway, I was treated at the hospital. I awoke in a hospital bed 3 days later, an IV dripping fluids into my arm and monitoring equipment beeping steadily beside me. Jenkins sat in a chair by the window, his weathered face lined with concern. When he saw I was awake, he moved to my bedside. "Welcome back, Miller," he said, his voice gruff with emotion. "You had us worried." "The creatures," I began, my voice a dry rasp. "The Forgotten. Did you find—" "Easy now," he interrupted, pouring a cup of water from a pitcher on the bedside table. "The doctor said you were suffering from severe dehydration, exhaustion, and possible hallucinogenic effects from an unidentified fungal toxin. There were spores in your lungs like nothing they've ever seen before." I tried to sit up, but weakness forced me back against the pillows. It wasn't hallucinations. They were real. They took me underground, performed some kind of ritual. Jenkins' expression shifted to one I would come to know well in the days that followed, a mixture of pity and discomfort. "We found evidence that you'd made camp near the eastern shore of the lake. Then something happened. Your gear was scattered, signs of a struggle. We think you might have been attacked by an animal, fell into the lake, and washed up on the southern shore. The toxins could have entered your system through an open wound. The markings, I insisted, raising a hand to my face. They're still there, the tall one's blood. But my fingers found only smooth skin, unmarked save for a few scratches from my flight through the forest. Jenkins shook head slowly. There were no markings when we found you, Miller. Just dirt, blood from some minor cuts, and what looked like plant residue. The doctors cleaned you up. I fell silent, confusion and doubt beginning to creep into my certainty. Had it all been a hallucination? A toxic reaction to some unknown fungus, combined with the emotional stress of Sarah's rejection and my isolation in the forest? Ultimately taken back to the station and sent home. I didn't actually believe what I experienced first. I thought it was some crude nightmare or horrible hallucination. But it wasn't until later that I realized it must have been something that really happened, because I actually had binding marks around my ankles, my thighs, my waist, and my wrists. Those bindings were on tight. The medical report noted ligature marks consistent with restrictive binding, but attributed them to possible self-entanglement in climbing ropes or fishing line during my delirium. No one would consider the alternative, that I had been bound with living plant material by creatures that shouldn't exist. I was placed on medical leave for 6 weeks, with mandatory counseling sessions twice weekly. The department psychologist listened patiently to my story before diagnosing me with acute stress disorder, possibly triggered by my recent breakup and exacerbated by isolation and exposure to unknown toxins. The mind is remarkably creative when processing trauma, she explained during our 3rd session. It constructs narratives to make sense of experiences too difficult to process directly. These underground creatures could represent your fears about the relationship ending, being dragged down into dark emotions, feeling bound by your attachments. Her interpretation made a certain logical sense, but it couldn't explain everything. The specific details of the forgotten, their appearance, their rituals, their strange language, seemed too elaborate, too consistent, to be mere fabrications of a stressed mind. And then there were the dreams. They began a week after my return home. Vivid dreams of underground chambers, of the tall one watching me with those bottomless black eyes, of plants growing from my skin like living tattoos. I would wake, gasping, certain that the markings had returned, only to find my skin unmarked in the harsh light of my bedside lamp. But sometimes, in certain lights or at certain angles, I would catch glimpses in the mirror of patterns beneath my skin, flowing like dark water through my veins. They would vanish when I looked directly, leaving me questioning my own perception. And I must have wiggled free enough that I loosened them. Like I said, whatever the bindings were this crude rope vine material. I've never seen it before in my life. None of them really believed me, though, when I actually got a chance to describe what happened. They thought I was either making it up or just had a bad nightmare. As you can probably bet, this incident has been difficult for me. At any rate, this is my story. I returned to duty after 2 months, but things were different. Jenkins assigned me to the visitor center rather than patrol duties, citing concerns about my recovery process. My fellow rangers treated me with a careful politeness that barely masked their discomfort. Word had spread about my breakdown in the woods. Sarah called once, awkwardly expressing concern about what she'd heard. "Mom knows someone at the hospital," she explained. "She told me you were found wandering in the woods, talking about underground people or something." The conversation was brief and painful, confirming that whatever we had shared was truly over. I requested a transfer to another park at the end of that season. Jenkins approved it with obvious relief, writing a carefully worded recommendation that emphasized my dedication and knowledge of park systems, while avoiding any mention of my experience at Lake Oroville. My new posting was at a small desert preserve in Arizona, about as different from the forests of Northern California as possible. No ancient trees, no dark undergrowth, no hidden caves. Just open sky and sun-baked earth that held no secrets beneath its surface. Or so I believed. It was during my 3rd month there that I found the petroglyphs in a remote canyon. Ancient rock art, estimated to be at least 2,000 years old according to the park archaeologist. Most depicted familiar scenes: hunters, animals, rain symbols. But on one sheltered panel, partially hidden behind a boulder, was a series of figures that stopped my breath in my throat. Elongated bodies, oversized heads with large dark eyes, long fingers ending in claws, and around them, rendered in the same red ochre, were swirling patterns identical to the markings I had seen on my own skin in the mirror. The archaeologist dismissed them as stylized shamanic figures representing the spirit world. But I knew better. The Forgotten weren't unique to Oroville. They had been here all along, retreating underground as human civilization spread across the continent, preserving their ancient ways in the dark places beneath the earth. And I hope you can get enjoyment from a real-life traumatic event. I don't care if you believe me, and if you choose to read this, which, by the way, you have permission to. I don't care if your readers believe me. I know there's something out there that lives underneath the ground, something that isn't quite human. Sometimes, on nights when the moon is full, I feel the markings burning beneath my skin. I wake from dreams of underground chambers and ritual chants with the Tall One's final words echoing in my mind. Remember, and fear the dark places. I do remember, and I do fear. But I also understand now what the Tall One meant when it called me a bridge. I stand between worlds, the rational daylight world of ranger stations and visitor centers, and the ancient shadow world of the Forgotten. I've never returned to Lake Oroville. My personnel file contains a medical restriction against posting me there, a bureaucratic blessing in disguise. But sometimes I wonder if the Forgotten are waiting for me. If the Tall One looks up from the darkness beneath the ancient trees and remembers the human who carried its mark back to the world above. Perhaps it's watching even now as I write these words, fulfilling the purpose it set for me in that underground chamber, to speak of what I've seen, to plant the seed of old fear in those who listen, to remind humanity that we were not the first to claim this land, and that the old ways persist in the shadows. Remember, and fear the dark places, as your ancestors did. It will keep you alive.